Secretary Kennedy has this MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, frequently targeting ultra-processed foods. If I'm truly wanting to solve all those problems, like I would be calling you every day to try and solve these problems. Is that happening?
No, not at all.
In our health lead, a top researcher for the National Institutes of Health shocked the scientific and medical communities this week by announcing his early retirement and blaming it on censorship from RFK Jr.'s administration.
I was really excited about this piece of research. We were addressing the question about whether or not ultra-processed foods high in fat and sugar can cause the same kind of changes in the brain's dopamine response as highly addictive drugs.
And they didn't seem to have the effect that many addictive drugs do. This narrative that
it's as addictive as crack.
That doesn't seem to be at work here. We had a reporter ask for an interview to discuss the findings of that paper for a piece that she was writing in the New York Times. And that interview was denied.
Not only were we not able to give talks, not only were we not able to publish our papers in the normal way, but now they're manipulating the way that we communicate our results to the public. That's a huge problem. If the premier biomedical research organization in the world is no longer interested in communicating science.
Welcome to the Checkup podcast. Today's guest is GOAT tier nutrition science, Kevin Hall, PhD, one of the top metabolism researchers in the country. His gold standard in patient studies have changed how we think about diets, especially ultra-processed foods, appetite, and weight loss. He's also the guy behind the Biggest Loser follow-up study that cut through so much diet hype with actual data. His new book, Food Intelligence, translates decades of studies into practical advice on metabolism, diet myths, and when to ignore the diatribes on social media. You'll hear us tackle calories in versus calories out, how to spot good versus bad nutrition advice, and why he recently left the NIH, and why, despite public promises by RFK Jr. around investing in nutrition and obesity research, the reality was that of censorship and corruption at the highest levels. It's honest, evidence-based, and incredibly valuable. I've discussed nutrition a lot on this channel. I've had nutrition experts on the channel. I've had misinformation nutrition experts on the channel, but I've never had someone of your caliber because you're really the top tier GOAT level nutrition expert that I think one could have on a show. So I appreciate you making the time to come here and talk with us about it.
Well, I appreciate those superlative introductions, especially given that my background in PhD is in physics, not in nutrition. So it's a little bizarre to be spoken of that way.
Well, I think the contribution that you've made to the field of nutrition research is immense because when people like me, I'm a family medicine doctor, when I need to figure out what to tell patients, it comes from the work you've done. In fact, when we think about the current state of healthcare in the United States, the MAHA movement, and the things that they're talking about with chronic health diseases, if we want to fix those things, we need to look at the work you've done and we need to fund more work for you to do. And we're obviously going to get into that.
Sure.
But if you want to tell the audience of how you got to your degree, which seems unrelated to the work you were doing in metabolic research, how did you get there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a long story. I'll try to shorten it as much as possible.
This is the beauty of the podcast.
Okay, great.
Nuance is king here.
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to be described in that way as a nutrition expert is I don't still see myself that way.
Interesting.
Because I've listened to folks on your show and friends of mine like Kevin Klatt, his entire background is in nutritional science and dietetics, and he has such a wealth of knowledge that I learned so much from these folks still to this day. And I know that there's huge gaping holes in my knowledge, and I kind of hope I know where those are so I can not look like a fool talking about those particular areas.
But that's what makes you an expert. A lot of people think expertise comes from an immense amount of knowledge. To me, I think it comes from immense knowledge of what you don't know.
It's both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to know what you don't know.
Sure.
And you also have to know with relative degrees of certainty and uncertainty about what we do know quite well, what we're still going to be surprised about in the future. We think we have a pretty good handle on something, and it turns out, oh, that was wrong. I kind of messed up with that. And then there's always going to be some things that we think we have a really good handle on. And it's going to take a lot to shake us out of our beliefs, but we should still be open to being wrong about those kinds of things and knowing the standard of evidence that's going to be required to do that. So it's a backup of how I got interested in this. I wanted to be a physicist. I wanted to be, one of these hardcore particle physicists, theoretical physicists. I was always like fascinated by, why does anything exist? Why do we have matter? Why is it not mostly antimatter as opposed to the normal kind of matter? All these like big questions that, a high school student might have in their later years of high school. And I enrolled in a physics program and was doing pretty well. But there was always this one guy who was always at the top of the class, and this was just easy for him, right? I mean, for me, I was pretty easy for the most part until like the final year of my undergraduate physics degree, where I realized, I was pretty good at mathematics, but this guy had no challenges in math. I mean, not quite Goodwill Hunting level.
It's funny, that's the comparison.
Right, exactly.
That's where my head was also.
I could see. But I sort of came to the realization that, I could bash my head against the wall for the next, 40 years of my career and probably make a decent living. Or should I start to look around and see, maybe those dreams weren't really for me? Was I better suited to do something else? And I happened to get a job over a summer in a physiology lab. And I was doing some electrophysiology experiments with smooth muscle cells. And I started reading about these kind of very old papers by Hodgkin and Huxley back in the 1950s, who were building mathematical models of how nerve cells were firing, like what was going on with respect to the action potentials. How do nerve cells fire? Can we actually build a mathematical model of that? And I got really interested in this. Maybe this is kind of the sweet spot, because there's something really interesting from a biological perspective. You could apply math to it. And fortunately, and this is in Canada, I'm Canadian originally, and there was this really interesting program at McGill University called the Center for Nonlinear Dynamics in Physiology and Medicine. Okay. So nonlinear dynamics is basically what a lot of people think of as chaos theory. Like that's where it got really popular for a brief spurt in like the early 90s or so. And it was basically a group of mathematicians, chemists, physicists working in the physiology department. And they were trying to apply mathematical methods to understand abnormal heart rhythms, for example. And that's kind of what I did my PhD on. I was interested in cardiac arrhythmias and trying to develop ways to diagnose one versus another. Was something an ectopic foci focus in the heart, or was it more of a reentrant loop? How could you tell that with a limited number of electrodes, as the cardiac electrophysiologists were doing at the time?
So a lot of axis diagnosis.
Yeah, and trying to use the geometry of the heart and how waves propagate to just kind of figure out what was going on. Now we have like these amazing mapping technologies that people can use to kind of really target where to ablate or burn pieces of heart tissue. But back then it was like you had like one little catheter with maybe 4 electrodes on it, and you were just trying to figure out where it was, right? And so I was kind of trying to mathematically model this and come up with some, useful algorithms. We actually started to file a patent about this, about how to kind of locate these different abnormal regions of the heart. And then we dropped it because my supervisor was like, I'm a theorist. I don't want to deal with these patent things. And I think something got sold from a Stanford group many years later for like $100 million piece of technology that was like, man, if I just pursued that. But yeah, so it was a fun sort of place to be, but and there was a kind of a critical mass of folks who were doing this kind of work, but they had kind of done something which was really interesting. I never really thought of this before. The cardiologists weren't paying any attention to them. So they were building these mathematical models, and we published a couple papers in cardiac electrophysiology journals, but hardly anyone ever cites them. They're too mathematical for most of the folks reading those journals. We weren't doing great SciComm back then on how to kind of translate these results to these folks. And yet there'd formed a critical mass of folks in the field that could then publish their own stuff over and over again, get grants to kind of do this kind of work, but they were having very, very little impact. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I want to do something that's actually going to be picked up by more people and maybe have an impact on improving the lives of folks. And so I was kind of in this weird disillusionment state at the end of my PhD program. And a group of folks had come up to take a summer course that the Institute was offering. And I was teaching part of it. And they were also recruiting folks to come to the San Francisco Bay Area to join this little biotech startup called Entelos. And I was, I think, employee number 14 or something like that. So it was the early days. And they said to me, what we're doing is we're building computer simulation models of different disease types with in coordination with pharmaceutical partners. And we've decided that you're going to be in charge of our type 2 diabetes program. I'm like, okay, that's cool. What's diabetes? Like, no clue, right? Yeah. And they said, don't worry about it. We're also hiring like a life science person who's going to work with you, and you're going to have many meetings with the folks at Johnson & Johnson, who was the pharmaceutical development partner. And yeah, that's where I started learning about endocrinology and metabolism and, what happens to the food once we eat it in terms of carbs, fat, and protein. How do they interact in our bodies? How the different organs communicate with each other through hormones and metabolic fluxes, and trying to then simulate that knowledge in a computer simulation, and not just in diabetes, but in the normal physiology as well. In other words, what do you have to do to the normal physiology to create, first of all, a normal simulation in normal physiology? What do you have to do to kind of make a realistic simulation of people of varying degrees of insulin resistance, of varying degrees of impaired glucose tolerance, and how does that progress over time? It was a huge challenge. And I mean, we had some success. The company's no longer existent, so in that sense, it wasn't that successful. But this kind of area of research has kind of been absorbed into different pharmaceutical companies now. They do some of the stuff in-house. But that was just a fascinating area. And I just sort of realized this is kind of my wheelhouse now. I have a sort of gut feel for how this system works. And I didn't feel like I was bashing my head against the wall as hard as it was. And I knew that there was certainly limits to not just my knowledge, but knowledge overall in this field. I felt like, this was something I could make a difference. I could actually better understand this. So when I saw that the business model of this company was kind of not working out, I was starting to think about, okay, where can I go and continue this kind of work? And right around then, the NIH was recruiting folks for a new lab that was, again, trying to recapitulate this idea of bringing people with quantitative training together to work on biological problems. And so I started a tenure track position at NIH, and I was there for 21 years. So, yeah.
What was the time frame that was happening?
It was 2003. Okay. I joined the NIH. And initially I was just doing this computer simulation modeling again, now looking more at obesity and looking at kind of longer timescales about what happens to people's body composition as they gain and lose weight. How does their metabolism slow down or speed up? How do we swap out nutrients like carbs and fat in the diet? How does protein play a role in those kinds of things? And I was this was also during one of the many rises of low carb diets. And so there was this idea at the time that a calorie is not a calorie, that, low carb diets have some sort of metabolic advantage. I'd read,
South Beach Atkins.
Yeah, Atkins' book and making these very, interesting claims about this. And I thought, well, what is the model that we're building? What does it say? And we made certain predictions. And I remember I was giving my sort of mid-tenure review talk. And I was talking about this model that I'd built and how we were making certain predictions of experiments that could be run at the metabolic unit that had opened, I think, in 2004 at the NIH Clinical Center. And I thought, it'd be great if we could get some of the clinicians to do these kinds of experiments. And so after the meeting wrapped up, the scientific director at the time of our institute said, that was really interesting. Why don't you do those experiments? What are you talking about? I have a physics PhD. I can't do this, right? And that was one of the really remarkable things at the time. The NIH was the kind of place where they didn't care that much about your background. If they thought that you had a really good idea and the motivation and the drive to actually learn what was needed to actually do this, they would take a chance. And that was, I don't think that there's many other places on the planet that would allow me to do that. And they supported me. They said, okay, well, we're going to teach you what an IRB is. We're going to teach you what a clinical trial looks like, how to write one, how to power a study. In other words, how do you determine the number of people that you would need in order to see the kind of effects that you're predicting in your model. And then what's sort of feasible, what's not feasible. And yeah, I sort of thought they're only going to give me one chance to do this. And I roped in all these other folks from different institutes. At that time, the too big to fail was kind of the buzzword at the time. I'm like, I'm going to make this too big to fail, but they can't stop this study. I've got like folks from the Addiction Institute involved. I've got folks from the Mental Health Institute. I've got like
got the buy-in.
I got
across
buy-in
the board.
across the board. We're going to do this crazy study, and it took forever, right? And I hired this very brave postdoc who'd done some human metabolic physiology studies in the past. And I said, look, I've never done this before. I'm going to be relying on you like a ton. And I sort of realized it was just me and him. And eventually we had like an undergraduate research assistant. I learned early on, like I should not touch any of this equipment. I like no skills in that regard whatsoever. I just would like stand back and like, I'll help explain the study to the patient, we'll get their consent and I'll check in every once in a while. And even that was like, yeah, probably not a good idea for me to check in. My bedside manner's not necessarily the best. But these folks did just a remarkable job, but it took forever. Like we started that study in 2009. So that's when we got the protocol approved. We published the first paper on it in 2015. It was in 19 men and women with obesity. They stayed for a month in two-week blocks at the NIH Clinical Center, where we manipulated their diet under super highly controlled circumstances, trying to see if the effects that our model was predicting turned out to be correct, or were some of the effects that were being propagated at the time about low-carb diets or carbohydrate restricted diets having the kinds of effects that on metabolism that were expected. Were those going to win out? And it was a fun and frustrating time because we were running on a very small team doing this.
I'm curious, based on the models you were running, how were they comparing to existing knowledge at the time? Were they finding things that disagreed with common understanding in the space?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. It's a bit of a yes and no type of question.
Yeah,
so So the idea at the time, depending on who you were listening to, if you were listening to the folks in the low carb space, there was this idea that this idea that a calorie is a calorie is nonsense, right? Because bodies aren't bomb calorimeters, as people talk about. Bomb calorimeters, a way that you measure calorie content of food. And we metabolize fuels very differently. And so to kind of translate what you see in a calorimeter to what you see in a human is like a leap of logic that many folks in the space were like, yeah, that's just nonsense. But there actually is a very long history of this where people actually discovered this idea that a calorie is a calorie from doing exactly those kinds of studies. We talk a little bit about it in the book of Max Rubner, this amazing German physiologist who basically he was doing these experiments on dogs where he was interested in how do you feed dogs to change the rate at which they lose body fat. And he found out that if you give dogs sugar, you have to give them twice as much sugar in grams as you have to give them in fat and oils to kind of slow the rate of body fat loss from starvation to the same extent. And that was a big mystery. Like, why is it that you need so much more carbs than you do fat in a gram basis to slow body fat loss to the same extent? And so he worked out the precise ratio, and then he had a bomb calorimeter, and he, lo and behold, found out that, fat has about twice the number of calories per gram, a little more than sugar. And it was the same sort of relationship. And so he's kind of put two and two together. It's not the grams that mattered. It's the number of calories that the food contains that mattered. And then he went on to show that, in dogs, this idea of conservation of energy holds in dogs, and thus was born the idea of a calorie is a calorie. Our models were showing that that in humans, our human models were showing that, yeah, it's really close to that, but you could actually devise diets that would deviate from that rule very slightly. Like we're talking, it's very difficult to measure. And that's why we designed the study with such meticulous care to measure like every 0.1 gram of food that people were eating and making sure they were eating all the food.
So just to catch the audience up,
Yep.
you were designing a study that was looking to see if you change the macronutrient content of food, so basically changing the amount of carbohydrates, proteins, or fats someone's consuming, to see if changing the combination of those, but keeping the calories the same, would impact their ability to lose or gain weight.
Body fat.
Or body fat
Yeah,
specifically.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and Rubner, this guy from I guess it was the 19th century, would say, yeah, no, a calorie is a calorie. We've worked that out. At the time, there were folks saying, no, low carb diets are going to have an advantage, right? Because you cut carbs in the diet, insulin levels go down, that releases fat from fat cells. You're going to burn more fat, and therefore you're going to lose more fat. Whereas if you don't cut carbs and you just cut fat, for example, the same number of calories, but keep carbs and protein at baseline, then you're not going to get a change in insulin, and that's going to keep the fat in the fat cells. You're not going to change how much fat.
Known as the CIM model.
No,
Or
that's not quite.
exactly?
The CIM model is a little bit different than that, but we can maybe talk about that.
Sure.
But in this case, it's just a question of reducing the carbs. Does that have a preferential effect to increase body fat loss as compared to reducing fat, regardless of whether or not it has to do with obesity, which is what the carbohydrate insulin model is about.
Got it.
And so our model simulated many of these physiological processes, but it said that for certain amounts of cutting of carbs versus cutting of fat, if you just cut one versus the other, and you kept the other two macronutrients at baseline values to kind of maintain weight, that if you cut 30% of calories from carbs versus cutting 30% of calories from fat, this on the same people in different occasions, the time when you cut fat in the diet would lead to tiny little bit more fat loss, because the model made a weird prediction, which said that the amount of fat that the body is burning shouldn't depend at all on the amount of fat that it's eating. That's really weird, right? I mean, it's like you cut a stick of butter out of your daily diet and your body doesn't bother to register that you did that, and it keeps burning the same amount of fat. There are folks that said, there's no way that's going to happen. What's going to happen is your body is going to adapt to the fuels that it's being provided, and the amount of fat that's being burnt is going to go down. And as a result, you're not going to lose as much fat. That was one prediction.
When you were creating the model, the simulation here, you need to obviously set parameters and rules for it.
Mm-hmm.
What research were you kind of feeding into the model? How are you deciding what research to use? And did you feel that the model had any gaps in its knowledge?
Oh, the model has huge gaps, right? And we're feeding into the best sort of previous studies. And what we'd done is we'd looked at the study where we had an overfeeding of fat or overfeeding of carbs. And in that case, the data suggested that indeed, when you overfeed fat, nothing happens to the amount of fat that the body burns, at least in a relatively short-term basis. And that was kind of interesting. And we used that piece of information in the model. And I thought, I kind of suspected that wasn't going to be the case. So my sort of MO when designing an experiment is I'm happy to be wrong.
Yeah, we're trying to do the null hypothesis.
I would love to learn something that we didn't know before, because the model makes a prediction based on what we previously knew. If the model's wrong, it means we're learning something new. Or I should have known it. Maybe it's not new. Maybe I just was too boneheaded to have known it and read the right paper previously. But at least it has the potential of showing something new. Alternatively, if the model's right, and in this case it was suggesting that the proponents of low-carb diets and the metabolic advantage of low-carb diets might not quite have it right, then that's also interesting. So I try to design experiments so that no matter what the outcome is, it tells us something interesting, right?
So then when you compared the research that was coming out of the simulation versus doing it in real life, what did you find?
Well, I was a little disappointed that the model was right. So, which, I mean, again, it's a good thing that, okay, we kind of knew enough going in to build a model that accurately predicted what was happening in these real people, not a real world situation by any stretch of the imagination.
In the metabolic world, situation.
And it's an incredibly tiny difference. So that what happened was many of the things happened that the low carb folks have said, which is absolutely right. You cut carbs in the diet, insulin secretion goes down. Insulin is secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas, roughly in proportion to how much glucose is around in the blood. And if you cut carbs, the glucose levels go down, insulin secretion goes down, and that's exactly what we saw. We also saw that we have these wonderful respiratory chambers where we can put people in and measure on a minute-to-minute basis how much oxygen they're consuming, how much carbon dioxide they're producing. And from that, we can calculate how much carbs they're burning, how much fat they're burning, how much protein is being used, and how many calories they're burning overall. And what we found was indeed exactly like many of the folks were talking about mechanisms of low-carb diets, is that the insulin secretion goes down, free fatty acids go up in the blood, the fat cells are releasing more fat into the circulation, and you're burning more fat. And that sort of seemed to plateau after that week or so that we put these folks on the diet. Therefore, because the fat intake didn't change, right? You only cut carbs, fat oxidation goes up, you're burning fat, you lose body fat. The trouble is that when you do the opposite and you just cut fat, keeping carbs and protein at baseline, the model was correct, and I was surprised that the model was correct, that the body doesn't decrease the amount of fat that it was burning. It keeps burning the same amount of fat. And insulin secretion doesn't go down because carbs didn't go down. So in this case, you also lose fat, right? The fat that's coming in the diet goes down. You're still burning the same amount. You've got to make up the difference from somewhere. It's coming from body fat. Body fat is always releasing fatty acids and resynthesizing them. And so you didn't need to stimulate that process necessarily to lose body fat. And in fact, they lost a little bit more body fat. So, but again, tiny, tiny amounts, physiologically, clinically meaningless differences. But from a kind of a theoretical perspective, it suggested that, if low carb diets are working for some people, it's not because of some magic about, reducing insulin levels and being able to have this metabolic advantage that Atkins had promised in his first edition of his book. He talks about the high calorie way to stay thin forever, right? You just have to lower carbs, you'll burn so much fat, and your total calorie expenditure will go up like crazy, and therefore you will be able to even eat more calories as long as you don't eat carbs, you'll lose fat. And what we were seeing was not that. We were seeing something quite different, that the reduced fat diet seemed to have a greater effect, although, like I said, meaningless from a practical perspective.
And you were pointing out that this was going on for 1 month with 2-week intervals.
Yeah. So we brought people in on 2 1-month periods, 5 days. They kind of ate this baseline diet to kind of keep them in balance. And then we did another 5 days, 6 days where we cut the either carbs by 30% of total calories or fat by 30% of total calories. Then they had like 3 days to eat whatever they wanted from vending machines. Then there was a washout period. They went home, and then most of them came back for the second period of time. They got the alternate diet. Got it. So it's a crossover study. So the same people on the same diets. And yeah, so it's a powerful study design because everyone is acting as their own control. Right. And yeah, we saw many of the physiological effects that were predicted, and yeah, it just turned out that particular mechanism of action wasn't occurring, despite what was being at that time. We're talking, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, as being, perhaps the most popular diet that was around.
Were there critics at the time saying things like the study was too short?
Oh, yeah.
You would see different metabolic adaptations after the fact. And what's your response to
That's
that?
absolutely right. Yeah. And not only was it too short, but it's also completely unrealistic, right? So again, I'm not trying to give diet advice to people. And that was the other thing that was interesting. There were folks on the other side, these low fat, especially there's like this group of vegan low fat folks that were out there, John McDougall being one of the most prominent ones, who would call me up and invite me to his to give talks at his events and saying, this is great. I'm so sick of the low carb folks, and you're showing that low fat is better. I'm like, no, I'm not. I mean, there's like a meaningless difference here. But he saw in our data what he wanted to see, and the low carb folks saw in our data what they didn't want to see, and made very valid criticisms, saying, this is meaningless for most people because you didn't control how hungry they were. They had to eat all the food and nothing else. You didn't go low carb enough, which is probably true for the way that most people do low carb diets, or at least they say they do low carb diets. It was too short. If you'd waited longer period of time, you would have seen something different. Lots of every study has things that you can point to, because you can't control everything. And if you do control everything, then it's not realistic. Yeah. So it's always this sort of thing. But every study can then build on the knowledge that we have based on other things to try to piece together or triangulate what must be closer to truth than any one single study can.
So you've taken this first step to try and parse out at least this incredibly controlled physiology of what happens when you cut carbs versus when you cut fats. You've kind of created at least a starting point of it doesn't matter in the short term in this highly controlled environment. What's the next step? How do you build off of it?
Yeah, so we ended up doing, because of these very concerns about you didn't do it for long enough, you didn't go low carb enough. I think one of the other studies that we did next, and this was a multi-site study that I did with colleagues around the country, is we brought in 17 men actually, who were overweight, and we kept them for 2 continuous months. And we ran them in on this kind of standard American diet that was high in sugar, high in carbs, and we cut their carbs to 5% of their overall calories.
Ultra low carb.
Yeah, so ketogenic diet is 80% fat, kept protein intake constant the whole way along. And there we were really, the main outcome was, okay, if you went to this very low carb diet, could we see this metabolic advantage, the increase in calorie burn that is seen, or that Atkins has promoted since, the early 1970s, the so-called metabolic advantage. And so what we did was we had these folks for the first month on this kind of run-in diet. They were losing weight, which ended up being a little bit of a critique. We weren't able to kind of keep them in weight maintenance, and we sort of had early discussions of, should we increase the number of calories, and then do we have to extend the duration of the run-in diet? So we decided, let's just keep calories constant, and we can see if the rate of weight change is altered, the rate of body fat change is altered, and we'll try to adjust for this in the data. So again, not a perfect study. And then after that first month, we said, okay, we're going to put these folks in these respiratory chambers for 2 continuous days and measure the total number of calories they burn. And then after a month of this ketogenic diet, we'll do the same thing, put them in the respiratory chamber for 2 continuous days. And if we powered the study to detect a difference of 150 calories a day, because our model suggested that there would be some differences in efficiency amounting to a little bit less than that. And so we wanted to see if there was any additional benefit more than was expected. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, we didn't see it. But we actually—
in fat loss specifically?
No, this was in energy expenditure, calorie expenditure. So they were burning more or less the same number of calories, regardless of this huge swap.
And you were calculating for those who lost weight to decrease.
Yeah. So if we adjusted for that, mm-hmm. It still was a very, very tiny amount, much less than the 150 calories per day. But then what I didn't mention is we actually had people in those respiratory chambers every week for 2 days. Mm-hmm. And when we looked early on, we actually saw a bigger effect. It kind of went up to, I think, about 100 calories a day difference during sleep. And then it kind of petered out by the end of the experiment, so that when we looked on those final days, that effect had dissipated. But something happened early on, which we still don't really fully understand. I have some hypotheses about what that might be, but those are just that. And so it seemed like the early phase you would see something, not the later phase. So the criticism about not waiting long enough didn't seem to hold up
as it went away.
Right, as it went away over time. But then, of course, you could say that, oh, maybe it'll go back up again if you did, instead of a 2-month study, a 3-month or a 6-month. Of course, that might happen, but I don't know that there's any reason to suspect that it might happen. The other thing that was interesting was that when we used another method to measure calorie expenditure, something called the doubly labeled water method, at the time, it actually did seem to detect a signal, and it was about 150 calories a day. But that's not how we powered the study, and that method has a lot more noise with it. Mm. And we didn't understand it at the time, so we published that data. We said, that wasn't the primary outcome, but it looks kind of interesting. And it was actually only later that we realized that the calculations for the doubly labeled water method, they overestimate calorie expenditure when you make the wrong assumptions about low carb diets.
Got it.
And so when we were able to correct those assumptions in a later paper, we actually brought them in line with the respiratory chamber, and that sort of started to make sense to us.
Why was there a shift from focusing on fat loss to energy expenditure?
Because we could measure it easier. in this particular study. That was, and it was also something that people were talking a lot more about at that time. Was they said that the calorie expenditure that we could measure in a respiratory chamber has a much tighter confidence interval. It's much more precise measurement than body fat.
Okay.
And so, and that was another mechanism by which people had proposed
The body fat
would
would be
occur.
less
Yeah,
than-
exactly. It would, if you increased energy expenditure enough by a later time point, then of course you could maybe extrapolate to how much body fat loss would be meaningful over a longer period of time. And what I didn't mention is that in that study, I mentioned that people were losing weight and losing a little bit of body fat during the standard high sugar, standard American diet. When we switched them to the ketogenic diet, in that kind of first couple weeks, they actually slowed down their rate of body fat loss just slightly, and then it picked back up again. So that over the both 2 week periods, 1 month periods on each of those diets, they were actually losing more body fat on the higher carb, higher sugar diet than they were on the ketogenic diet. Now, again, meaningless small differences, and the uncertainty around those numbers is quite large. But it just kind of shows again that the body isn't completely perfect. You don't have to completely be a calories a calorie. It just has to be good enough, and that's kind of how evolution works, right? And there's a really good reason why this happens, right? It's because
as humans, you never know what you're going to get.
Exactly. And, humans have been successful all over the planet on a wide range of different diets. If you couldn't store fat after a big game hunt, it was like a carnivore type diet, that would be a big problem, right? So of course you have mechanisms to store body fat when you're in caloric excess. But, and it's more or less equivalent when you account for those incoming calories to a higher carb diet. But there are slight differences that you can pick up in these kind of contrived studies, and that's kind of what we were interested in delving into.
I'm curious, looking back at it now, do you feel like, this could be just an assumption on my end, that the critics were guiding your research in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have guided otherwise?
Yeah, but I think that's a good thing.
Okay.
Right? I mean, I think that that you have to listen to critics when they're making sensible.
Do you feel like it was sensible in that case?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think like many of them went a little over the top with some comments here and there, which
Sure.
I didn't necessarily appreciate, and some of the comments I didn't think were reasonable. But yeah, I mean, I think as a scientist, you can't pretend that you've designed the perfect study. And even that study, like I said, there's legitimate criticisms that they were losing weight the entire time. What would have happened if they'd been in a state of weight gain? The folks who talk about the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity will say, we're interested in what causes body fat gain, not what most influences body fat loss, right? Because those don't have to be the same thing.
Right.
Just because you're able to treat something with a drug doesn't mean that they had that disease because of a deficiency of the drug, right?
Right.
The treatment doesn't have to be the same as the cause.
Right.
And so I think that's also a legitimate criticism, right? If you're going to talk about causes of obesity, does this really have a something to say about it? I think it does have something to say, but I think it's a legitimate criticism that, yeah, we haven't measured people in overfeeding experiments. Other people have, and suggest that it actually doesn't, there's not much support for that theory, but we didn't do those studies.
Right. Do you see any other changes in this research in people's biomarkers? Were you looking at any other variables as not the primary outcome?
Oh yeah. I mean, because we have this wealth of information from these people, right? We measure so many things on them, right? And I think that's another thing that's important, right? Is that people go on these diets not just to lose weight and lose body fat, but for all sorts of reasons. I mean, that's probably a main reason that many of them go on these kinds of diets. And some people find it really beneficial and some people don't. And again, depending on who you're talking to and what sort of tribe they're in, they'll tend to generalize to the other tribe as being misguided in some way.
Right.
But yeah, so there's all sorts of things that happen, right? I mean, one of the things that was really interesting in that study when we got to these very, very low carbohydrate levels is that insulin secretion goes down by like 50%, meaning that people don't require as much insulin to kind of manage their glucose levels on a ketogenic diet as they did on the kind of higher carb, higher sugar diet, which isn't
Is
that
expected.
surprising.
Yeah.
And again, it's an extrapolation, but and there's been other studies that have looked at people with type 2 diabetes. They don't need exogenous insulin anymore when they go on and stick to some of these very low carb ketogenic diets, well, at least a large chunk of folks. So there are therapeutic uses for these kinds of diets, not to mention the fact that under really controlled conditions, ketogenic diets can help treat children with epilepsy that have been, resistant to pharmaceutical interventions. We did another study where we did another ketogenic diet, which had a lot of non-starchy vegetables with it to try to make it as healthy as possible, as compared to a vegan diet that didn't have any animal products and was higher in carbs and starches. And we collaborated with folks looking at immune system function and seeing how it seems like, and again, this is early days and we don't really know what this means, but it seems like when people go on a ketogenic diet, their adaptive immune system is amped up. Whereas when people go on a vegan high starch diet, their innate immune system is amped up. And both were better than when they started at baseline by various different markers. What that means, I don't think we know, but it's really interesting to see how there's so many different physiological functions that are dependent on the kind of diet that people are on. And what does that mean for general health? We don't know yet. We need to do more studies. What does it mean for people with different kinds of pathophysiologies? We don't know that yet either. There's so much more to learn, which is exciting.
Yeah. I'm probably going to be asking you to theorize a bit here, and this is just my medical curiosity.
Yeah.
The connection that exists between the ketogenic diet and potentially helping children with seizures, given your research in the EP world, is there some sort of link with arrhythmias and ketogenic diet that you see a potential for?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why
I don't know. Yeah,
because what is the mechanism by which maybe again you're not familiar with, but for why the ketogenic diet works in those children?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of theories, and they range everything from the hottest buzzwords in science of altering the gut microbiome, and that somehow through the vagus nerve going to influence the brain and the sort of excitatory
GABA,
potential of. So there's all sorts of theories about that. There's theories about, well, when the brain is running on ketones as opposed to glucose, or at least an increased proportion of ketones, that changes the redox state of the cell, and that can change how excitable it is. And if it's more excitable, then you're more likely to kick off a seizure. All perfectly reasonable sounding mechanisms, but that's one of the things that's interesting in this space is that many folks will have a very convincing mechanism that sounds very sciencey and maybe even quite plausible, and yet then you should go and try to design a study to test it, whether it's in animals or organoids or humans.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we're going to go into why that's problematic these days.
All right, cool.
For sure. So after you did the next building block of this research of doing the very low carb diet, where did you go on from there?
Yeah. So up until that point, and we did this crazy Biggest Loser study too, which is another story.
Yeah. Actually, let's talk about that because
okay.
this gets referenced so much in probably ways that you wish it was.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, up until that point, I'd been focusing on, when we control people's diets, right? And we are focusing on how the body is using those fuels and how is metabolism slowing up or speeding down, slowing down or speeding up. What are the effect sizes that we're seeing? And there was one case where we actually started to see really big effects, right? And that was this Biggest Loser study, right? Which was, and again, this was a study that I just was watching reality TV and saw these folks stepping on scales at the end of one episode. And I'm like, you lost 15 pounds this week. I'm like, what the hell is going on? I'd been studying, we built one of the kind of foundational studies for one of the models that we built was the Minnesota starvation experiment, which was done on conscientious objectors in World War II who were volunteered to serve their country by engaging in this starvation experiment that Ansel Keys conducted. And they're losing a lot of weight over a relatively short period of time. And I'd seen people with bariatric surgery losing weight at a pretty rapid pace, but not at 15 pounds a week, right? It was like, what is going on? So I watched more episodes of this show and saw a lot of trainers yelling at people on treadmills and people throwing up, and didn't really see them eating much. And so, but the message was clear. It's like the exercise was responsible for the weight loss. But it wasn't clear what was going on in terms of their metabolism. Because there was this idea at the time that if you just did enough exercise, we know from that Minnesota starvation experiment that people, when they lose weight by starvation, cutting calories, their resting energy expenditure, the number of calories their body's burning just to kind of stay alive at rest before you're moving around, crashes. And it's viewed as a very bad thing when it comes to weight loss. Of course, for these folks, it probably prevented them from dying in the starvation experiment. Right. But
and when you say crashes, what is the number drop in the basal rate there?
So in the Minnesota starvation subjects, it went down by an absolute amount of 40%. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's a relative amount. 40% reduction. Now, some of that's to be expected just because if you have less cells or less amount of mass of the body, you need less energy to move around. But even when you account for that, there's a greater than expected reduction of energy expenditure. And that
was that ever quantified with calories?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of, for the Minnesota starvation experiment, I think it was roughly 200 calories a day, greater than you would expect. So it went down by more than that in an absolute sense, but because they'd lost so much fat-free mass, there was a large expected reduction of calorie expenditure. Right. But even then, at the end of the starvation period, it was down by, I think it was roughly 200 calories per day. And so and these folks had become very sedentary. It's like they couldn't move. Like former athletes were like frustrated with themselves. They were failing like their exercise treadmill tests, and they just had no energy. They spent most of the time, fortunately, that was summer in Minnesota, they spent laying out in the sun because they were cold most of the time. And so they just became, as you might expect, starving people to be ornery folks who didn't want to talk about doing any of their chores and things like that. And so here were like these folks on this reality TV program losing weight at a much faster clip, doing all this exercise. And I don't know how much they're eating at all. And there was this idea at the time that if you just did enough exercise, you could prevent the slowing of metabolism because you preserve your muscle mass. And it was clear these folks weren't just doing aerobic exercise. They were doing resistance training, cross-training, all sorts of things. And then there's the other question, well, how much are they eating? And what fraction of the weight loss that we're seeing is because of what's being portrayed on television, which is all this grueling workout and these challenges, versus are they eating anything, right? I had no idea. And so I don't remember how I got this information, but I found the telephone number for the doctor who was in charge of the care of he has this nice little Beverly Hills clinic. And I got him on the phone, and I actually, for the first time in my life, I pulled out, "Hi, this is Dr. Hall from the National Institutes of Health. I'd like to talk to you about the Biggest Loser program." It's like, "Oh yeah." And he's a very gregarious guy, a really interesting character. His name's Dr. Huizenga, Dr. H on TV. And he told me about how it was partly his idea for this program because he used to be the team physician for, at that time, the LA Raiders. And he noticed that many of the linemen couldn't keep their weight up when they did 2-a-day trainings. And that was a big problem because they had to stay massive to play the game correctly. And he had the idea of, well, what if we could get people with obesity to exercise as much as a professional football player doing 2-a-days? I mean, they wouldn't have any choice but to lose weight. And so I guess that was like part of the pitch for The Biggest Loser, and it became crazy. I mean, nowadays people don't realize how popular that crazy program was. Huge, It was on for many, many, many seasons. But anyway, so I was more interested in, is it true that they can prevent the slowing of metabolism? Right. How much is the exercise?
Because it was obvious too that they would lose weight with the massive amount of exercise, the fact that they're cutting huge amounts of calories, you assumed, right, at the time.
And yet, then there was this, and what was being talked about was that they wouldn't have the slowing of metabolism because they were doing this exercise.
Right, yeah.
And so,
which logically, did that make sense to you?
Not really.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, not really, because, and that would always be my pushback against the folks who made that claim, because when you look at the resting metabolism of skeletal muscle, it's really low. It's only 15 calories per kilogram. And a kilogram of muscle, like 2.2 pounds of muscle. It's hard to grow 2.2 pounds of skeletal muscle. All for the benefit
while
of,
in a deficit.
Yeah, while in a deficit, right? And all for the whopping benefit of 15 calories a day. I mean, are you kidding me? This is like nonsense, right? But, maybe there was something else going on with exercise. Maybe there was some sort of hormonal thing or inefficiency and the rebuilding of the proteins costs energy. There's all sorts of reasons why that might increase metabolism. So it wasn't a no-brainer that this could be complete fallacy.
So you were open to it.
Yeah, of course. That's how I think everybody should go into every sort of study they're contemplating. And so I got him on the phone. I'm like, okay, well, do we know anything about how many calories they're burning? He's like, well, they exercise for like 3 hours a day. Jesus. And we can make some guesses, but no, we don't have any direct measurements. I'm like, do you measure how many calories they're burning at rest? He's like, yeah, no, we don't have anything on it. Like, okay. Do you know how much of the weight that they're losing comes from like body fat versus muscle? And he said, oh, actually, yeah. And because his Beverly Hills clinic was decked out with all the same body composition assessment equipment we had at the NIH. They had a DEXA scanner for very large people. They had a bod pod. They had bioimpedance. They had all sorts of toys. And so he had data from all the seasons of all the contestants. He's like, yeah, that's his wheelhouse. That's what he's interested in. He's like, yeah, they lose by far more fat than people who are on bariatric surgery. And that kind of makes sense given the exercise that they were doing. And like, how much are they eating? It's like, oh, well, we give them instructions to eat above a certain amount. Like, okay, how much are they eating? It's like, well, we don't know. Like, oh, they don't prepare. They don't get their meals prepared for them. It's like, no, they do it themselves. And they just have a kitchen at this ranch in Malibu, and it's stocked with like
ingredients.
The promoters of the show. I think at that time it was Jenny O turkey.
Oh my God.
It's like everything Jenny O turkey in this refrigerator. Anyway, so I was like, well, I'd be really interested in having like one of my postdocs come out and maybe make some measurements on some of the contestants over the course of one of the competitions. And he was really into it. And he was like, yeah, let me talk to the producers. And eventually that's what we ended up doing. I worked with a colleague of mine, Eric Ravison at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. Another long story. The NIH wouldn't let me do the study. They said, no, we're not going to associate ourselves with reality TV.
Missed opportunity there.
Yeah, and I sort of thought, I'm not one to take no for an answer, at least not the first answer. Okay. And so I met Eric at a conference, and I said, Eric, have you ever seen this show? And he's like, yeah, it's a horrible show. I was when I was president of the Obesity Society, we wrote a scathing letter to NBC about how stigmatizing it is. I'm like, yeah, I agree. But wouldn't you like to study them? He's like, I got his postdoc interested, and eventually we took the protocol I'd written for NIH and modified it for their IRB, and it got approved there. And so we sent out our postdocs and some equipment to Malibu to test. In fact, we sent supplies to the contestants before they knew they were contestants. At home, we got like the list of the folks who were selected, and we gave them scales. We gave them doubly labeled water, and to measure how many total calories they were burning even before they knew they were on the show. And then when they went to Malibu, we set up like a little pseudo metabolic unit where we had people measuring their resting metabolic rate with metabolic carts. And we designed the study to just assess, did their metabolic rate change by the amount that you'd expect given their weight loss, or was there something extra going on, or were they able to preserve their metabolic rate at a higher level as many of the folks in the exercise and physiology community had predicted. And so we went back out there several times. I say we, mostly the postdocs. Again, don't let me touch equipment. Yeah. And when we got the numbers back at the end of the weight loss program, it was really interesting because they had on average, they cut by about 65% of their calories. Huge cut in calories.
Right away.
Yeah, like during the competition, they just cut calories enormously. And they were doing the equivalent of 3 hours of vigorous exercise a day. And their calorie expenditure went up by about 1,000 calories per day. And so they're eating this huge deficit, and they're losing weight at a rate of a pound a day. That's the other thing. TV time is not reality
Real time.
time, right? So 15
they lose
pounds,
15 pounds in one
a
show,
week.
yeah.
It's more like 15 pounds over 12 to 15
Got it.
days, right? Between episodes, right?
Right.
So it's not a real week. So that was one thing I learned really early on. But the average weight loss was a pound a day when they were on the ranch. When they went, the way the show worked is that people got voted off occasionally. Then at the end of 13 weeks, everybody went home. They came back at week 30 for like this reunion or I guess the finale of the TV show to whoever be crowned the biggest loser. And at that point, even when they went home, they're still losing weight at about a pound. Half pound a day. So it's cutting their rate of weight loss in half, but still a huge deficit and still doing about an hour of vigorous exercise every day of the week. So the idea that people with obesity don't have willpower is just nonsense, right? I mean, this is like an insane amount of willpower. And then they left their families while they were in Malibu, but they came back and they tried to go back to their usual life, and yet they're still able to do this for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. And then when we looked at the metabolic rate, it had crashed. It clearly gone down more than you would expect based on their body composition changes. And we're talking on average 400 calories a day more than you would expect. And the way that, and then what we were interested in was, did that slowing of metabolism predict who would regain weight later? Because that was another kind of myth that was out there. It wasn't a myth at the time, we didn't know, was that the people who would have burnt the fewest number of calories because their metabolism had slowed down the most, they should be the ones who are most susceptible to weight regain. And so we brought, by this point, the NIH had kind of come on board. And so at the 6-year mark, we brought everybody back, actually minus 2 people, to the NIH Clinical Center to have the kind of follow-up measurements. And on average, they regained about 2/3 of the lost weight. We had one person continue to lose even more weight.
Wow.
Some people regain all of the weight and more. So there's a wide range of weight regain and continued weight loss. But there was no relationship between how many calories their metabolism had slowed at the end of the weight loss period and who had regained. We couldn't predict it. And the most shocking thing, and the thing that got all the press attention, was the fact that despite regaining the weight, like we mentioned before, larger bodies have higher metabolisms, burning more calories at rest. They're on average didn't change from at the end of the weight loss competition. The resting,
so they permanently decreased.
It was decreased. Yeah, it was still at this low level, and
even though they were a third still lighter, because they regained 2/3, but they had a third lighter than when they.
Yeah. So they were still down by a third on average.
Yeah.
And my expectation was that their resting metabolic rate would go up as they regained weight,
and they didn't.
And that didn't happen, and that was like so shocking to me. I was like, all right, what's different between when we measured it then and when we measured it now? And we realized we were using different actual pieces of equipment to measure metabolism. We used the one from the Pennington Center when we were out in Malibu, using the NIH one. Like, okay, well, we calibrate them on both occasions, but it's possible. Let's fly the one at the Pennington Center to the NIH to check and see if they're measuring the same. And that wasn't it. They were measuring the same thing. So we had no choice but to kind of, you got to believe the data, as unbelievable as it is. And then it got even stranger, because when we looked to see who was most successful at keeping the weight off, it was the ones who continued to have the greatest slowing of metabolism. Okay.
It's like contradiction after contradiction of what you would expect.
And it turned out that was also true in Malibu. The ones who had lost the most weight were the ones who had slowed their metabolism the most. And in that period, another piece that was kind of interesting was that when you looked for a correlation between who was doing the most exercise or the most physical activity versus who was cutting their calories in their diet the most, there was no correlation between the differences in physical activity and weight loss, but whoever cut their calories the most lost the most weight. They were the ones who kept had the greatest slowing of metabolism. And the complete flip at 6 years, the ones who had increased their physical activity the most had the slowest metabolisms and had the most success at weight loss.
Interesting.
Whereas energy intake calorie intake didn't. There was no correlation there. So really weird stuff. Turns out that some of those things have been replicated in other cohorts, right? but not all of them. And there's still some mysteries there. But the way we like to think about it, or at least the way I like to think about it now, is the only way to make sense of that relationship between energy expenditure and metabolic slowing and weight change is that it's a response, not a determinant. In other words, think of that metabolic slowing like the tension on a spring, and you've got the spring, you're not doing anything, and there's no tension. You pull the spring, that could be the equivalent of weight loss, however much you can pull the spring, you get a greater tension, there's a greater pullback. And so that's the metabolic adaptation. You pull more, you get more weight loss, and you get more pullback. But it's always in proportion to it's a proportionate response to the amount that you're pulling. So for whatever reason, the people who are most successful at making those lifestyle changes, either on the ranch in the Biggest Loser competition or in their lives 6 years later, will get the most weight loss, but they'll also experience the greatest tension on the spring, the greatest amount of pullback of metabolism. And the frustrating thing was that when we reported that and it got all this press attention, it was like literally on the front page of the New York Times, no one reported it right.
Well, how are they reporting?
They were saying, oh, it's the slowing of metabolism that caused them to regain the weight.
Which is not the pattern.
It's not the pattern. We saw no correlation between those two things. And that this is the reason why they can't keep the weight off. It's like, no, the people who kept the most weight off, even lost even more weight, they had the greatest slowing of metabolism. And so it's not determinative. It's not helpful necessarily. In other words,
so
if it
does
didn't
it also
happen,
the spring analogy works because you're essentially the spring ends up losing its elasticity.
yeah, if you magically you're pulling at it with the same tension, you magically cut the tension on the spring. Of course, you'd pull it to infinity, right? But so you would be even more successful, right? So,
But meaning that it doesn't at some point it doesn't bounce back.
at some point,
It
well,
doesn't recoil.
Well, no, at some point that would make it easy, right? Then you would suggest that the people who are most successful, if you waited long enough, should have the least tension in the spring. And that's not the case, right? I don't think it resets that way. At least we didn't see any evidence of resetting over 6 years.
But how come when they gain the weight back, like what is your theory as to why the rate didn't go back up?
Yeah, I mean,
That's what I mean, that the spring gets stuck.
So again, complete speculation, but when you look at, there's this idea from ecology where we have energy budgets for different amounts of everything that we do in our bodies costs energy, right?
Yeah.
And this was most recently popularized by Herman Pontzer, who wrote the book Burn, which is a great exposition on this idea. Because he looked at hunter-gatherer tribes who were very physically active, and they're also smaller, so you have to adjust somehow by their body size. But when you adjust their body size, and you look at how many calories they're burning in total, it's no different than sedentary office workers. And so for a wide range of physical activities, it seems like there's some sort of trade-off going on. And so what we saw in The Biggest Losers was that the ones who become the most physically active, and by the way, they'd all become much more physically active than they were at baseline,
Right.
that perhaps for many, many good reasons, their metabolic rate dropped. So for example, if their liver is making less pro-inflammatory proteins, right? Protein synthesis is an energy consuming process. Maybe that is getting toned down because they're now more physically active. We know physical activity does have a beneficial effect on these kinds of processes. Other cases are, the example of, female athletes who do or training for marathons and things. They stop menstruating, right? And so there's an energy cost to doing that. Maybe this kind of budgeting of energy is changing depending on the amount of physical activity. So I think that on average, our sort of guess, and it's only a guess, is that people, when they started the Biggest Loser competition, they were not particularly active. They become crazy active during the competition, unsustainably so. But many of them kind of are able to incorporate that into their daily life. And even though they regained 2/3 of the lost weight, by the way, they're still down, I think 12% on average from where they started 6 years before. And the ones who are most successful are doing the most physical activity. And they're the ones who have the greatest slowing of metabolism. So maybe there's this interplay between the energy that your body's devoting to physical activity and these other compensatory metabolic changes that are going on. Complete speculation.
But it would strengthen the notion of why it's so difficult to lose weight with just exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is that aspect, and that's been one of the messages that Herman Pontzer has been talking about. And there was a recent paper about this in a big cohort of folks using doubly labeled water and resting energy expenditure. But it really spoke to the idea that you could have these big effects on metabolism finally, but they worked in exactly the opposite way that many people thought they would work in terms of how they relate to weight loss and success at maintaining weight loss.
So you do this research, you find all of these very interesting, perhaps unexpected findings. The New York Times is publishing the incorrect evaluation.
They got some of it right.
Well, right. They got some of it right. But the major takeaway, they kind of flipped and went in the wrong direction.
I mean,
what do you do?
It wasn't just them. I mean, it was like,
well, right.
I mean, even my co-author of the book, she admits, oh yeah, I reported that wrong too.
So what do you do in that moment when you're seeing these headlines pop up and you're like, well, wait, that's not the.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that the other thing that was obvious was that people were clearly tying the concept of metabolism to weight in a way that wasn't accurate and was also very distracting from the really wonderful science of metabolism, right? That metabolism is in common among every living organism. And even folks, when they look for signs of life on Mars, they look for signs of metabolism. And it's because it's so fundamental. It's the thing that allows, complex organisms to be there, because that process by which we're harnessing the energy and matter from the foods that we're being provided, or even the sun and the air in the case of plant metabolism, and this flow of matter and energy is what allows humans and every other living thing to exist. And so it was frustrating to kind of see the popular concept of metabolism not only being wrong in terms of its directionality of its predictions, but its link with weight as the only thing that's important here. And just ignoring the fact that, every cell of our body is doing metabolism. It's this complex, like biochemical waltz of the miraculous ability to kind of turn the food and air that we breathe into, everything that we are and everything that we do, as my friend Charlie Brenner likes to say. And just missing the wonder and awe of that process, which I think is just fascinating. And that's kind of part of what our book is about, is to kind of give people that appreciation and the idea that, we're thinking of this miracle of nature as, oh, it's just about weight, right?
I'm curious to better understand your speculation as to the exercise being the component that's driving the potential drop in metabolic rate. What if, let's say, the Biggest Loser had no exercise component?
Yeah.
If it was just strictly a mini starvation experiment, essentially, would you have expected to see the same in the speculation?
Yeah. I mean, there have been studies that have looked at people who have lost weight and regained some of that weight, and they did not have an exercise component, and metabolic rate goes up.
Interesting.
And not
so then
only
it's
that,
not speculation then.
Well,
is it backed by?
Well, it's a different group of people, and
Right.
and there are limitations to those studies as well. You would have to the way you would do it is you do a randomization, right? You'd take a group of people and you randomize them to a diet alone or a diet plus exercise, and you'd follow them up for long periods of time, and you would measure different components of energy expenditure, their body composition over time. And that was the other thing that was really interesting, was that as silly and stupid as this Biggest Loser study was, there are a very small number of studies that have made those types of repeated measurements on the same people over time as they undergo major changes over years, right? You've got your, several week-long weight loss studies, maybe a year-long weight loss study, and then you kind of let them go, and maybe we'll see what happens in some subset of them. But that's not often the case, and those are the very rare examples. And who knows, maybe that's because of the funding cycles, and they only last typically 5 years or so. It's not exactly clear why that's the case. But yeah, I was shocked when I went back and said, okay, well, how many studies do we have to compare this to? Even this silly non-randomized study, kind of an opportunistic experiment that was natural experiment, and natural experiment that was happening. There really aren't that many, but the ones that we do have didn't involve a lot of exercise, and they did see their metabolic rate going up. So which again lends some support to that speculation, but I think it really is speculation. You could do that study better, obviously.
How are people these days misusing the research from that study or misapplying the research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still the same thing, right? Which is that they think that metabolism is somehow determinative of weight loss success. And it wasn't in the Biggest Loser case. And it kind of actually speaks to what ended up being a huge shift in my research program, which was I've been focusing on either really small effects of like carbs versus fat and energy expenditure or body fat changes, or even in this case, a big effect on metabolism that turned out to work in the opposite direction. So I started to think, okay, well, maybe more of the action is happening on the appetite and food intake side of the equation, right? We'd been doing these studies where we were measuring what people were eating or even controlling what they were eating, but we hadn't done studies where we tried to let people eat whatever they wanted and try to understand how is appetite controlled? How does it relate to body weight change? Is there some sort of feedback of as people lose weight, do they become, does their appetite go up? Yeah, I mean, there's anecdotes about this and people report this and have even seen changes in hormone levels that would tend to support these appetite related hormones. But how is that quantitatively related? How does that play out over long periods of time? And what is it about our foods and our food environment that might actually change the basic biology of appetite control? And that gets now to the question of why do we have, an epidemic of obesity? What's different now compared to before? We know that, a huge chunk of the heritability of obesity, there's somewhere between 40 and 60 or 70% of body size in a given environment is heritable. And we've now come up with, more than 1,000 different genes, or at least single nucleotide polymorphisms that are correlated with body size, BMI in particular. Most of those, the vast majority, seem to be genes that are acting in the central nervous system, in the brain, likely. How does that work? What is going on there? And what is the interaction between those genetic susceptibility and our environment? Is it on the physical activity side of things? Is it on the food environment side of things? Is it something completely different in our environments that may be causing this change? Or is it a general lack of willpower that manifests simultaneously?
Which some people believe is
simultaneously in all people around the mid 1970s and 80s, right? By the way, there have been folks who've studied this, right? They've looked to see, are there other kind of metrics that might be about conscientiousness and willpower that, did people, wear seatbelts and these kinds of behaviors and there's no difference in the rates. Obviously, when before seatbelts were popular, it's not a good example. I don't remember exactly what the examples were, but there was no evidence that there was these dramatic changes in conscientiousness or willpower over the course of the time that we had this increase in obesity prevalence. And the fact that it happened simultaneously in all age groups and all
internationally.
Yeah, well, it's not simultaneous internationally, right? Because there was
it
waves,
took a while,
right? And we were
to get McDonald's.
Yeah,
everywhere.
we were leading the world in that respect in some sense. But so, what is it like? And can we actually even explain that based on just the changes in the food supply? Like that would be one thing. Or can we explain it based on changes in physical activity? So I got interested in those kinds of questions. And then, so I was trying to, building these mathematical models of how much does it cost to gain weight? How many calories does it cost to gain weight and deposit tissue? And how does metabolism change? How does body composition change? And how does energy expenditure change? And that would have been like much of my research previously. And I was working with my colleague at NIH, Carson Chow, and he just asked a really simple question. It's like, did the calories go up enough in the food supply to explain obesity? It's a really good question, right? We have data about what's in the food supply. We don't have data about what was eaten, but we have data about what was in the food supply. And we know what it was in the US for very long periods of time.
Because currently it's around 4,000 per person.
Yeah, it's around 4,000 calories per day per person in the U.S. is available to be eaten. And in the 1970s, it wasn't that. It was about 3,200 or so per person per day. By the way, and clearly we're not eating that number of calories.
Of course, yeah. Well, at least you can't point to something to prove that.
Well, that was kind of, again, what we were trying to figure out, because we know something now. We've measured a lot of people about how many calories they're burning just to kind of maintain their weight. We know a lot about the calorie costs of weight gain. And so that was the question that we asked. Was that increase in the number of calories in the food supply since the 1970s enough to explain the average weight gain of an American? And it turned out it was way more than enough. So of that, 800 to 1,000 calorie a day increase in the food supply, only about a third is accounted for by the gain in body weight of the population. 2/3 were missing. We're like, what the hell's going on? We called it the dark matter of obese at the time. And then it occurred to me that there's actually some data that we could look at, because the EPA collects data on what's in municipal landfills, like how much construction materials there.
Interesting.
And how much food waste, solid food waste, is in municipal landfills. And they've been tracking this for decades. They don't normalize it usually per person in the population. So we took the census data and we normalized it. And we could track the same 50% increase in food waste since the 1970s, which was calculated based on our model that 2/3 of the extra food calories in the food supply that wasn't eaten represented about a 50% increase in food waste. And the EPA numbers turned out to be exactly the same per capita, 50% increase in food waste found in municipal landfills. So we were basically this calorie glut in the US food supply that at least could more than fully account for the obesity epidemic, and in fact accurately predicted how much food was wasted, which was really interesting. And so, it really raises the question, okay, well, what is it about our food environment how are some people resistant to this? Clearly, we didn't eat all of those extra calories. In fact, 2/3 of those extra calories went in the trash. What's the biology by which changes in the food environment change how much we eat? I mean, it could have been 100%. It turned out to be, not 100%. It was, only a third of the increased calories that were available were eaten. How are we so successful at getting people to eat those extra calories, or how is the food industry and the food environment so successful? And what was it about those food environments that has driven this increase in calorie intake? And so we decided to do some kind of silly studies saying, okay, well, we can take people and put them in a very artificial environment and control their food environment. And just give them more than enough food that they would need to eat in order to maintain their body weight. In the first study that we did of this kind, we kept the macronutrients the same. So carbs, fat, and protein, more or less the same. The amount of fiber was the same. The glycemic load of the diet was the same. The sodium content was the same. And in one case, we basically said, we're going to design a diet that was 80% of these so-called ultra-processed foods, which we could talk a little bit about. I know you've had others on your podcast talking about this. And in another case, we'll have no ultra-processed foods, all just like 80% of calories from minimally processed foods. And just give people really simple instructions. Meals will all be prepared for you. You don't have to do any work. You don't have to buy the food. We're just going to give you 3 meals a day and snacks. Eat as much or as little as you want. We're not even going to tell you why you're in the study. We're measuring lots of stuff. We're interested in how these different foods affect your health. And you're blinded to your weights. You're wearing loose-fitting scrubs, so you can't tell if your clothes are getting tighter or looser. And just eat as much or as little as you'd like. And in that study, I kind of thought that if we match for the nutrients and give them the same number of calories, and they don't have to do anything, they'll probably eat more or less the same amount. And maybe this idea of ultra-processed foods has more to do with the economics of food and how they're advertised and whatnot. Probably not something about the foods themselves. But I'm happy to be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then we'll show something else. Maybe they eat more of the minimally processed foods. Who knows what's going to happen, right? And it was the first kind of study that I'd done of this kind, of focusing on the food environment and people choosing whatever they wanted to eat.
The more behavioral aspect.
Yeah, exactly. And I was really surprised to find that these same folks, again, random order, 2 weeks on each of these different diets, same people, when they were exposed to this ultra-processed food environment, for whatever reason, they chose to eat more calories, about 500 calories per day more than when they were on the minimally processed diet. And they gained body weight, they gained body fat. And when the same folks were on the minimally processed diet, they lost body weight and lost body fat. And when we looked at their blood markers, in fact, the biggest difference from baseline was the minimally processed diet, because most of the U.S. food environment is already ultra processed. It's a hypothesis about why we saw that. But, for example, and again, these are not primary outcomes. The primary outcome was the difference in calorie intake. But when we were exploring these other things, C-reactive protein, which was, not high, but it was somewhat elevated in folks at baseline, 2 or so. It dropped by 40% on the minimally processed diet after 2 weeks and stayed at the same level of 2 or so in the case of the ultra processed diet. So it was really the minimally processed diet that were driving some of the biochemical changes. But then they were gaining weight and gaining fat on the ultra processed diet. And so that kind of was surprising. And I think, again, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, now I've got to try to figure out what the hell's going on. But yeah, for whatever reason, the diets that we provided to these folks, and that's the other thing, they didn't report them being any more pleasant. So we had them rate the meals, and they're also reporting to eating to the same degree of appetite, same amount of hunger, fullness, satisfaction, eating capacity. Yeah, meals are equally pleasant, but for whatever reason, they're eating more calories on the ultra-processed diet. And that study got way more attention than the Biggest Loser study. It got more attention than any other study I've ever done. And people had some very strong opinions about, what's going on. And again, it's one of those things where everybody sees in that what they want to see, right? The low carb folks are all of a sudden, it's highly processed carbohydrates that we're driving it, right? And the low fat folks, it's like, it's too much saturated fat. The seed oil folks are like, there's the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is all off. And and folks who've been studying eating rate noted that, in fact, people ate the ultra-processed meals more quickly than the minimally processed meals. And we saw
and then the marketing folks were like, the food's more colorful and pretty.
Yeah, who knows, right? So all sorts of things and it was so interesting because they're all perfectly plausible sounding explanations, right? Yeah. And even from scientists, right? Who see in their body of past work in this study, it's like, I know how to explain this. And many of them very confidently said, I know what's going on. Like, great. I guess I don't need to do any more work. I'm done. Just tell me and you'll write it up. And and I think they got frustrated because I would say, that's a great and really plausible thing, but we have to study it. We have to actually design a new study to determine what's going on. And, we did we worked with some of them to kind of do post hoc analyses of, let's take the meals and say, the meals were, the overall diets were matched for these different macronutrients, but on a meal by meal basis, they could vary quite a bit. Yep. Some of them had higher protein than others. Was protein a correlate? And so we do some statistical analysis. And again, that was another funny thing. It's like the higher protein meals led people to eat more calories, which is not what a lot of people would have expected. And I'm not against association. We didn't do a trial to test that. It might work out to be the opposite if you actually did a trial. And other folks were like a colleague, Tara Fazzino from University of Kansas said, I know you matched the overall macronutrients, but what about an individual foods? Did you present people with more foods that crossed either high fat and high sugar? So the overall diets are matched for fat and sugar, but maybe individual foods, maybe you gave them more individual foods that had these pairs of nutrients that she calls hyperpalatable, either high in fat and sugar, high in salt and fat, or high in carbs and salt. And sure enough, when we looked at the data, it's like, we actually did give them more.
Well, that's what ultra processed foods are, basically.
Well, no, there is some non-overlap.
Okay.
There are some ultra processed foods that are not high in both of those nutrients.
Okay.
And so when we did some analysis, it turned out that that actually might explain some of the effect. Another person, Barbara Rolls at Penn State University, has done a remarkable career looking at the energy density of diets, so the calories per gram of food. And she said, well, yeah, I know that the energy density of the overall diets was matched, but if you take out the beverages and you just look at what's on the plate, the ultra-processed diet had much more calories per gram. And she's right, they did. And there's this argument about whether or not beverages can contribute to, appetite control or not, and whether or not you can dilute the overall energy density of your diet by, drinking more water or something like that. But she's right. When we took out the beverages, the calorie density was different. And it's interesting, right? Because the macronutrients are the same. So it's not because it has more fat versus carbs. And remember, fat has more calories per gram than carbs. It was because the ultra-processed foods are drier. They have less water in them. We've destroyed the food matrix, the cellular structure of the food. And that's actually on purpose because you're trying to extract the water to make them more shelf stable and prevent bacterial growth. So really good things to do if you're going to have...
And potentially lead to overeating.
Yeah. Well, yeah, who knows? Right?
Well, theory-wise.
Yeah, in theory, right. And so energy density turned out to also play a role in our post hoc sort of analysis. And other folks had other ideas like the ratio of overall carbs to fat, and we've worked with them to kind of look at some of these other things. But at the end of the day, you've actually got to design a study to test it, right? And you can only design a study to test so many things at once. And so before I left NIH, we'd started that study. We'd been running it for almost 3 years because it takes forever to do these kinds of studies because the facilities that we were doing it at, where we kind of bring people in, house them for a month at a time, and even for modest-sized studies, we can only house nowadays about 2 people at a time. So to do a study,
why is that a limitation of cost?
It's it's a limitation of the facilities. So it's basically a hospital ward. Hospital wards are expensive. You have to have nursing care, but for our studies, you don't really need all that degree of expense. And that's something that had been working with NIH folks for years about. Could we just rent like a retreat facility for a summer and bring in everybody at once and hire some staff to kind of go out there and measure all these things? We'd have a study that takes 3 years done in a matter of 3 months over a summer. And we were working on kind of doing some pilot studies like that. And even broader, I was thinking, if we really, and I was trying to get the new administration interested in actually developing a facility like this, not just for us, but for nutrition scientists all over the country to do the best quality science where we have the most control over people's environment for not just food environmental exposures, other environmental exposures, and be able to test some of these hypotheses that are now being treated as facts.
Right.
And so anyway, so it takes a really long time in doing this for the 3 years. And so we designed this study to try to get at what was it about ultra-processed diets that were driving people to overconsume calories. And as we speak, the last participant is currently enrolled at the NIH. It's been about 3 years since we've been doing this darn thing. And hopefully we'll have an answer for that question soon.
Interesting. This is going back a bit. It stuck out in my mind. In the Minnesota study, where it wasn't exercise driven and it was nutritionally driven weight loss, we saw the rate drop, the metabolic rate drop. After they were fed, was there data collected if their metabolic rate returned to normal? Yeah,
so they did follow up so they did. The study was actually designed for the rehabilitation phase. So these folks were conscientious objectors, not starving for the sake of starvation, but because people in Europe were starving during the war. And Ansel Keys wanted to know, what's the best protein relationship? What's different amounts of vitamins do we give? What's going to have the best benefit in terms of rehabilitation? The short answer was that, and he had them divided up into different groups with different kind of refeeding diets. And to his surprise, there wasn't any measurable differences between the different diets that he designed. So he had this refeeding phase, and yes,
which needed to be done carefully to avoid refeeding syndrome.
Exactly, absolutely, yeah. And it was done in this very stepwise, methodical manner.
Were they aware of that at the time, or did that develop from his research?
No, I think that they knew something about refeeding syndrome, just in treating like cases of severe malnutrition in the past. So he was very aware that he had to ramp this up slowly. And so, there was this period of ramped up where it's very controlled, kind of gradually introducing the calories, and people were regaining weight. And yes, their metabolic rate started to climb. So again, another data point suggesting that the physical activity might have played a role in the Biggest Loser folks. And then he had a subset of them after the main study was done. He said, okay, just eat whatever you want. And they hadn't recovered all of their body weight yet. Mm-hmm. And they ate, like, at that point, I think it was like almost 6,000 calories a day for a while. Like, wow. They way overshot what they were eating initially. And that eventually came back down as they regained all their weight and all their body fat. So it was a really interesting study, again, suggesting that there might be some feedback between how much weight you've lost and the signals to your brain to kind of recover weight that has been lost.
Point.
Yeah. And I would argue that set point is, well, we've got, if there really is a set point, then why is it that when I change someone's food environment, all of a sudden they're eating 500 calories per day more, gaining weight? In the other case, they're eating 500 calories a day less and losing weight, right? So it's
hijackable.
It's a resettable set point. Yeah. Actually, we're some of my colleagues that are doing these really sophisticated neuroscience experiments in mice are starting to piece together how that works. And it's really the early days of this, but the point is that these are not just kind of independent ideas of our food environment really does affect the biology of appetite control in very fundamental ways. It's not just like, I used to have this analogy that I used to think about of maybe what's happening is, it's like it's a very hot day in New York here today. Maybe if it was, we have an air conditioning system that works and can keep this room pretty comfortable. But if it goes up another 15 or 30 degrees outside, right? The air conditioning's nothing broken, right? The thermostat's still set at this level. Yeah. Maybe it's just being overwhelmed now, right? It's always on, but the temperature difference between the inside and outside is too much. Maybe that's what was going on with these different food environments, right? You're being the same physiological system is just being overridden. That's the way I used to think about it. I don't think that anymore. I think that you're also just resetting the thermostat. Mm-hmm. And that's based on, what little I understand and know about the biology of how the so-called hedonic and homeostatic feeding circuits actually interact with each other, how different food environments affect where animal models are regulating body weight. There's this classic experiment that Tony Sclafani did where he gave rats a supermarket diet. And he was able to see that for the first time in his experience, he was able to get adult rats to gain weight at a rate that was similar to when he ablated part of their brains. So something about the food environment is actually affecting our brain in ways that we just don't fully understand. And it's doing it more like resetting the thermostat than it is overwhelming the air conditioning system.
Kind of to maybe make an analogy to a person listening who's not a researcher in this space, the opposite of a GLP-1. Okay. Like an anti-GLP-1.
Right. And how GLP-1 drugs work and how bariatric surgery works to reset at a lower level, I think, again, are really amazing questions that we haven't fully worked out.
Yeah.
And it's not like people initially thought for bariatric surgery, you're just not absorbing the calories. It's like, no, for most bariatric surgeries, digestibility and absorption of calories is pretty darn good, right? There's some malabsorptive procedures, but those are few and far between. And GLP-1s are working to somehow reset our appetite control in a very unphysiological way, right? I mean, the GLP-1 is a naturally occurring hormone that goes up after eating. And now we're able to pharmacologically increase it by, 100-fold more than the normal levels and keep them high for, a week at a time. And that's not a normal situation, right? That's a very abnormal situation. Again, it treats obesity and type 2 diabetes quite well in many people, but it's not because they were GLP-1 deficient, right? Right. That's not the cause of the obesity epidemic. So.
Also, this is a curiosity point of mine, because in all of these studies where we're looking at the decrease in the metabolic rate, perhaps tied to initial weight loss based on nutrition, perhaps retained drop in metabolic rate from perhaps exercise, that's in individuals who are losing weight, who perhaps had some sort of nutrition state, right? So what happens in people who are, let's say, high-performing athletes or people who exercise regularly? Does that mechanism still hold true in them, or is that a completely different model?
That is not my field, and I don't know enough about it. I was really interested in this idea of professional athletes after they retire, right? Because again, the idea that they're doing so much training and they might be so focused on their nutrition and building muscle and trying to be so efficient. And different kinds of sports have different different things that they're optimizing under. And what happens after they retire and are no longer doing that? How I think that's a really interesting question. I've done no research on that.
Because I'm just trying to follow, if we do the speculation of exercise impacting metabolic rate, I could think of a retired NFL player, how easy it might be for them to gain weight if they've hurt or lowered their metabolic rate.
It's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. I guess the question is it true, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Or is it more, again, on the food intake side of the equation? And is metabolism only responding to those changes and those other lifestyle changes? And again, I just want to be clear, exercise is great for overall health. Right?
Yeah, we're not saying
but it's one of those things that, and in fact, like The Biggest Loser suggested, it might even be beneficial, and other studies have shown this too, for weight loss maintenance. Again, the people who were the most physically active at 6 years tended to maintain the most amount of weight loss. They also had the greatest slowing of metabolism. So again, metabolism following the horse, not leading the horse.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Before we get into the current state of research and where you are now, take me through your thoughts on the competing models. Based on what we know now, calorie is a calorie, calories in, calories out versus CIM model.
Okay. And there's all sorts of other ones in between. Yeah.
The reason I bring up those two specifically is there's been some guests on the channel that have had debates with me about what they think is going on. They disagree that dropping someone's calories will lead to weight loss, calories consumed would lead to weight loss. They explain that they believe if you cut someone's calories by even 800, let's say, that there wouldn't be weight loss long-term because their body would adapt to that 800 calorie deficit. And my response has always been like, even in The Biggest Loser study, we saw 400 calorie drop in extreme weight loss. How would the body compensate 800 calories? Yeah. So what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, so I think that the point that they are trying to accurately make is that that calories in, calories out is not like a zero interest bank account, right?
Okay.
So if you think of your body fat as being the balance in your bank account, and all that happens if you withdraw more than you're putting in is that you linearly will, or if there's some constant imbalance, then you will just withdraw all your money until it goes negative, right? Until you start owing the bank money.
Right.
And similarly, if you eat a little bit more calories than you burn, then you will just accumulate body fat. In this case, you're depositing a little bit more than you're withdrawing. You will gain as much money as you need. These two things, calorie intake and calorie expenditure, are not independent quantities in the body, right? So like we mentioned before, you cut calories in the diet. Yes, calorie expenditure goes down and appetite goes up. We did this really interesting analysis with my colleagues at Johnson & Johnson where they were giving SGLT2 inhibitors. These are drugs that increase the amount of glucose that's spilled in the urine in people with type 2 diabetes to manage their glucose, but it also acts as a sink of calories, right? And for the higher doses, you're getting to about 360 calories a day lost. And it's pretty consistent after the first initial period. And so,
and cardioprotective.
Yeah, there's lots, there's all sorts of really interesting questions about how they have those effects. And they're really interesting drugs. But I was interested in the question of, okay, well, in a placebo-controlled trial, do these folks lose as much weight as you'd expect based on the calorie output side of the equation, right? Now you're increasing calories out by 360 calories per day, and they lose weight and they plateau after about a year. And on average in this placebo-controlled trial, I think they'd lost 4 kilos. So not nothing, but if you actually did the math, they should have lost 3 times that amount. And what ended up happening, we validated a model to kind of try to predict how calorie intake changes very slowly over time, was that people compensate for a huge amount of those excess spilled calories by increasing their appetite.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they're eating more calories. They end up eating very close to the 300 plus calories per day, more after 1 year. Their overall energy expenditures dropped by a very tiny amount because they only lost 4 kilos. And the thermic effect of food is only 10% of that drop, or it's actually maintained because it's going up a little bit. So appetite seems to be related to how much weight people are losing. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to kind of not have this zero interest bank account analogy, because what's happening when people are trying to change their lifestyle to lose weight is that they have this dynamic effect on metabolism. It's not as big as your previous guests have suggested it is to prevent. And in fact, the bigger effect is the increase in appetite, which is again in proportion to weight loss. And we come up with some numbers about this. So roughly speaking, for every kilo of weight that you lose, your body's overall calorie expenditure will go down by about 25 calories per day. So you lose 20 pounds or so, you're looking at 250 calories per day less energy expenditure to maintain that lower weight. Appetite, on the other hand, goes up by about 95 calories per day above baseline for every kilogram of weight that you lose. So the appetite control side of the equation is much more powerful in determining where you're going to plateau, how much weight you're going to lose, and how hard you're working constantly, even after you've plateaued, right? Because you're fighting a greater and greater battle in terms of your appetite, the more weight that you lose. And you're also burning fewer calories, but that's the minority of things. Mm-hmm. It's the appetite control piece that I think is the really important fact. And so I think it's no accident that these most successful weight loss drugs on the market are really focused primarily on changing people's appetite by mechanisms that are, again, still not fully understood. So that's how calorie in, calorie out really works. It's this dynamic phenomenon, right. And it's not the zero interest bank account. So from that perspective, they're completely right. Now, the other question is, what is driving those appetite changes? What's driving the changes in calorie expenditure? And oftentimes people will say, well, it's hormones, right? And yeah, some hormones can play a role.
Oversimplification.
Right? Yeah, they certainly can, right? Yeah. And there are some people who, have obesity because, they're hypothyroid or something like that, but they're the minority of folks. And what, again, some of these folks have focused on is they'll say, okay, well, let's just take a more basic approach. And they come up with a very compelling sounding story, which is that, well, what is it that drives accumulation of fat inside fat cells? Well, at the level of the fat cell, it's seeing these hormones. And one of the hormones that's involved is insulin. And we've known from basic endocrinology for decades and decades that insulin slows the release of fat from fat cells. It also stimulates the uptake of fatty acids from triglycerides that are circulating in the blood, stimulates production of fat from carbohydrates in a process called de novo lipogenesis. And so from the level of the fat cell, maybe insulin is a big player, and it is a big player. Is it the only player? No, it's not the only player. But they ignore that other side because they're building a case here. They're building a story. And the story goes that, okay, well, if insulin has this major role, then what drives insulin? Well, glucose in the blood drives insulin. What drives glucose in the blood? Carbs in the diet drive glucose in the blood. And so if you're eating a very high carbohydrate diet, you'll drive up insulin levels, and that will tend to promote storage of fat in fat cells. And every one of those, there's evidence behind every single one. They're not wrong behind those. And then they might be oversimplified. There are other things playing a role, like triglycerides in the blood also slow release of fat from fat cells and stimulate uptake of fat. But we're going to ignore that. Right?
And fat can be dietary fat can be directly absorbed.
Well, it's not directly absorbed.
Meaning stored.
It can be stored, right? Yeah. But the point is that people focus mostly on insulin's role there. And there have been really interesting experiments done by Keith Frayne at Oxford when he was active. He's retired now, but he's done these really remarkable studies where he keeps insulin constant and infuses a lipid emulsion that has these triglycerides in it. And he measures the same processes of how much fat is being released from adipose tissue, the fat tissue, and how much is being taken up. And triglyceride molecules themselves, especially dietary triglycerides from chylomicrons, also inhibit lipolysis as potently as insulin. And they also stimulate the uptake of fat from those triglyceride molecules themselves. So the body has lots of ways of getting those calories stored inside fat cells. But again, those are only a few pieces of data. We need to better understand that process. We don't understand it nearly as well as we understand the role of insulin in regulation of fat storage in fat tissue. There's lots of really interesting research that should go on there, but it's been demonstrated to hold. And so the story then goes, well, if the calories are being stored in fat tissue because you're eating too many carbs that are causing these spikes in insulin, then that's going to starve the rest of the body of fuels, which is going to make you hungrier, and it's going to slow down your metabolic rate. That's a really interesting theory, right? I mean, it's kind of turning the causality on its head in terms of, oh, well, you're just overeating calories and you're too sedentary, and that's the reason you're storing all these calories in fat tissue. This kind of makes a compelling case that no, actually the hormonal milieu, because of the diet that I'm eating, is what's storing the calories in the fat tissue, and I'm only overeating because of my fat tissue expanding and keeping those calories. And so it's a really compelling story, and people have made that story and modified it over the years in various different ways. And we've designed studies to try to test that, and we don't see all of those pieces of the puzzle kind of coming together in that way. Doesn't mean it's wrong.
It's just incomplete.
It's incomplete. Yeah. And are there other theories that are out there that are perhaps more compelling? We kind of hold to another theory that we think is a little bit more compelling. Happy to be wrong, but you have to design the right experiments to kind of test these competing theories, and I think everybody agrees on that.
What's the other theory that you're...
So it has a terrible name. I don't think it's the right name. It's called the energy balance model. It's okay. What I think you were alluding to as calories in, calories out, but I think the point is that it's not the simple zero interest bank account model. It's the model that says, yes, the body sends the brain signals all the time about what its needs are. Hormones play a role. The nervous system itself plays a role. Who knows, the gut microbiome may play a role.
Sure.
The different tissues and their energy states may play a role. Clearly, we have to have this in order to grow an organism, right? If you have to modify the composition of a growing body, the body has to send the signal somehow of what its needs are. But the environment that we find ourselves in also plays a role. We're seeing what the availability of food is. We're learning about food in our environment and our social interactions and what's available to us versus what's kind of aspirational, what kind of time constraints we have, the social pressures, all these broader things that we call the food environment. And that those two things, the internal signals and these external factors of the food environment, are being integrated in our brains in very complicated ways that we clearly don't fully understand right now. But it's that integration of those two facts.
In your analogy of the bank account,
yes,
we're not factoring in the interest when we do calories in, calories out exclusively.
Right.
Does the interest represent behavior?
No.
Is that all encompassing from an intrinsic and extrinsic viewpoint of what could be happening?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I think this is where the bank account thing falls apart, right? Because because what your social environment is how much you can put into or withdraw from the bank account, right? So these extraneous factors, in addition to your monitoring what's happening inside the bank account itself to redistribute your funds into different places. Maybe you could stretch the analogy to its breaking point. But the point is that our bodies have evolved in such a way that we're listening to our bodies, we're listening to what's in our environment, and we're integrating that in a very complicated way that we're only beginning to work out. At the end of the day, yes, there are things that are called laws of conservation of energy, which I think is what a lot of folks in the calories in, calories out camp will harp on. But the determinants of why is it that we choose to eat the way that we choose to eat in given social situations, given our backgrounds and our economic environment, and what is it our bodies are telling us that we should be eating, and how is that modified by the foods themselves?
Right.
That complicated interaction is what I think we need a lot more research to figure out.
Yeah. To defend the calories in, calories out, folks, I don't think they disbelieve that fact.
Okay.
I think a lot of them believe that, but it feels like to them, the people who are in other groups just discount at baseline the calories in, calories out model.
Okay.
So to them, it's like, no, that just doesn't exist. And it's, no, it exists. And then there's all these other factors at play. So at least that's the way I've seen it play out on the social media.
Now defend
sphere.
the carb insulin model, folks.
I would love to, but the fact is, I feel like whenever they're presented with data that's conflicting, instead of explaining, it's complex and there's other factors, they try to shed some sort of shade on the research that was done.
Let me be fair. Let me push back a little bit on that. I think that they are unfair in a certain extent, but they're also doing something which is rational in another way. Because what they do is they say, okay, Kevin Hall, you did this experiment, seems to suggest that the carb insulin model isn't giving the predictions that the data suggest. Well, you just haven't looked long enough, and you haven't done the right experiment. And they would say that one way to say that is that they're throwing shade on the studies, and they're throwing shade on my motivations for doing the studies. And there's probably a part of that, but there's also the unspoken fact, which was, look, the basis of the carbohydrate insulin model was all short-term studies on how insulin affects adipose tissue. What you've just done is you've modified your own model, and you've modified it in a way that you haven't admitted to modifying it, but you've said, oh, actually, it probably plays out in a little bit longer time scale. And you weren't able to detect it in that experiment. If they were very open about that, I would be like, okay, cool, we can work together, right?
But they're not. They're not.
Some of them are, right?
I mean, some are, but then others will try and find the holes and find lean mass hyper responders as the outlier group or what have you. Like it's always something wrong.
Sure.
In order to prove, and I don't know why there's this, like, it almost became a church or a religion to them.
Yeah.
And I don't get that.
Yeah. I mean, but to be fair, I see exactly the same thing on the opposite side. Like I said, the McDougall camp of folks. I mean,
what did the McDougall?
So John McDougall, he's passed away sadly now. He's a very nice guy and very enthusiastic about my research, but he was a low-fat vegan proponent.
Got it.
And he saw in our research and how the low carb community had responded to our research, and he was very enthusiastic. Invited me to give talks to his followers, and got me connected with some other folks who are vegan advocates, and I would go give talks to them. And I remember one day after one of McDougall's advanced study workshops in California, it was a very similar setting to here. He brought me in for an interview afterwards, and he wanted me to say that, the low carb diets are horrible for you.
Yeah, low fat vegan is the way to go.
And low fat vegan is the way to go. And isn't your research really showing? I couldn't. I'm like, I think our research is
great
interesting.
On you because
I think it's really interesting, but I don't think it's saying what you think it's saying. And maybe I'm wrong, but we need to do more research that's more practical. If those are the practical questions that you're interested in, I sort of view myself more as a physiologist who's interested in how the body responds and working out what these appetite circuits are, and how the foods in our food environment are driving excess calorie intake, and how we can redesign our food environment to actually prevent that. So those are practical questions, but I don't design practical studies that are necessarily translatable in the way that many physicians want me to translate those studies.
Although I venture to say, while we don't know the exact mechanistic reason for the ultra-processed food group to gain more weight or consume more food, to me, that's practical enough data for me to recommend to my patients to limit ultra-processed foods.
So what if I told you, and I presented this data in November in London, the interim analysis of our current study is that we were able to design a diet that also had 80% of calories from ultra-processed food, and people did not gain weight.
I would take away, and this is speculative because I don't know the research, I would venture to say that the people on a practical level in the United States that are consuming American Standard Diet are not consuming the ultra-processed foods that you would be pre-selecting for that study.
Yeah, I mean, that might be true. And I guess the question is, can we use the knowledge about how we designed that diet to give both consumers advice of, look, ultra-processed foods, just because they're ultra-processed doesn't mean that they're necessarily unhealthy for you. Many of them are. what are the mechanisms? And if we could understand the mechanisms, then we would be able to tell our
In the
policy
future, for
folks,
sure, yeah.
our people who do regulation.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. And so
But I need to tell my patients something.
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. And
It's like almost, when you're teaching first grade math, I don't know if it's the right class where they teach math, and they say, oh no, you can't subtract 5 from 2.
okay.
Because negative numbers don't exist to each other.
yeah.
But it's valuable to teach them that.
Sure, of course.
So in the same way that like I have a limited amount of time with my patient, I need to make some impact on their life. Largely the assumption that they're consuming ultra processed foods that are driving their weight gain based on the knowledge I know now will help them. Do I know the mechanism? Can I be 100% sure? It feels like it's the best advice I can give.
So here's the problem, potential problem with
Right.
that, is that ultra processed foods by design are convenient. They can be incorporated into your life. They're inexpensive.
Right.
They don't require a lot of skill and equipment to prepare or store. And if you have the privilege of being able to avoid them, I'm not going to stand in your way. Okay. I think that, yes, you could do Michael Pollan's advice of eat food, and what he means is avoid ultra processed foods,
or increase
mostly
whole
plants
foods
and not too much. Yeah. And in fact, that's how we did it in our,
and that's where you saw the
ultra-processed
best outcomes from CRP model, for example.
Yeah, well, in that case, we avoided all ultra processed foods, but the way that we designed a diet that was still 80% of calories from ultra processed foods, but that did not lead to weight gain, is that we chose ultra processed foods and combined them with fresh whole foods or even frozen whole foods that reduced the energy density of the diet. We chose ultra processed foods that weren't hyper palatable by that Tara Fazzino's definition. Mm-hmm. And again, people were rating the meals as equally pleasant. They just weren't overeating them. But my point is that if an ultra processed pasta sauce or salad dressing makes it a lot easier for you to make a salad and make, pasta that's healthy for you and add some vegetables to that, then that should be encouraged, even though the whole overall meal is going to be labeled as mostly ultra processed.
I agree. In the future, this is a great reality for us to come to.
Yeah.
I just don't feel like that's the reality for most these days. I don't think most people, if we survey the American Standard Diet, if we see what percentage that they're consuming ultra processed foods.
You're absolutely right. But I think if we take this very broad category, right, which is a huge category,
right. The definition by which is not speculative. But,
yeah, I mean it's a reasonable first step, right? Yeah. And I think that what I would like to introduce is the concept that there are probably healthy ultra processed foods,
right?
And there's a bunch that are probably neutral for health, and then there's a fraction that are driving most of the problems. And I think what you're pointing out is that the ones that are driving most of the problems are often the ones that are most heavily marketed. They're available everywhere. Yeah. They're also convenient, tasty, and shelf stable, and are the ones that most people have access to.
And lobbyists are fighting for subsidies for.
Yeah. So I think that's and there I'm totally on board with you. But what I would love to see is the kind of promotion of the healthful varieties.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
And what sort of policies can we put in place?
Which is where we are today.
Yeah.
In a very bad position because, for the last hour and a half or so, you've pointed out all the amazing work you've done, the intricacies, the fact that you're always questioning your own work, even questioning others' interpretation of your own work, even though it could be beneficial to you. So A, I applaud you for that. Thanks. B, we need to celebrate individuals like yourself who are willing to do this work, because not everyone is. People oftentimes get married to ideas as researchers, and you're still trying to keep the most practical mindset to try and help the biggest number of people. Currently, we have people in the healthcare space. Secretary Kennedy has this MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again. He frequently speaks on the amount of chronic health conditions we have in the US, that it's a rising number. Obesity is a rising number, frequently targeting ultra-processed foods. You have to be his hero. I mean, if based on that notion of Secretary Kelly, there has to be a photo of you hanging up in his office.
Does it have a dartboard behind it?
No, but if I'm truly wanting to solve all those problems, I would be calling you every day to try and solve these problems. Is that happening?
No, not at all. It was interesting. I may or may not have mentioned, nutrition science and the kind of work that we've been doing has had dwindling support for a very long period of time. Back in the 2010s, the NIH defunded the clinical research centers across the country that had the facilities to do the kinds of work that we'd been doing at the NIH. And so the kinds of controlled feeding studies that we were doing and the investigation of the causes of metabolic disease just dropped like a rock. People wrote eulogies in the journal Diabetes. My friend Mike Jensen wrote a eulogy for the clinical metabolic investigator. And I don't know the answer to that question. I think that there's always been a stigma to nutrition science. It was in the home economics department in many universities. It was dominated by women for a very long period of time. And I don't know if there's a sexism involved in that. It was always a soft science. I'm not sure. I don't really know
It's
the
just
answer.
strange because we're seeing a curve go up with chronic health conditions related to nutrition. And then we're seeing nutrition research.
Right. Well,
drop.
I mean, to be fair, and I think this is, again, one of the messages that is probably accurate. And James Tabery did a really interesting book called The Tyranny of the Gene, which is about this idea of, the NIH has focused on treatment of disease, looking for genetic underpinnings, precision medicine. A huge chunk of money has gone to those kinds of things and has devalued environmental causes and better understanding how environmental exposures contribute to the rise of many of these kinds of chronic disease. And similarly, I think metabolic disease and obesity in particular has had stigma and continues to have stigma, where many folks just think, oh, people who with obesity just lack willpower. There's the gluttony and sloth idea of the original sins. And in fact, when I was doing my research many, many years ago, I would study people with obesity and insulin resistance. Because I'm not a physician, I would not study people with type 2 diabetes typically. When I started to think about studying folks with specific medical conditions, I was told, this would be great that you would study people with disease. I'm like, decade before, the NIH was one of the first to come out and say obesity is a disease. But even at the NIH, the higher ups didn't consider obesity as a disease and were saying, well, why don't you study people with a disease? I'm like,
yeah, I am.
What do you?
Is that just medical inertia from?
Probably.
Yeah,
Who knows?
yeah.
But then there was a period of time they actually tried to close our metabolic ward. In fact, that happened right after our ultra processed food paper got all this media attention. And I don't want to take credit for the fact that we didn't close, but I kind of went outside my lane and found somebody higher up in the Health and Human Services Department who I knew had read our paper and thought it was really interesting. And after I was told that I should have no confidence, I'll still be able to continue my research after our unit closes by a leader at the NIH. I'm like, okay, I got nothing to lose. And I talked to this guy and said, well, they're proposing closing our research facilities, and it'd be really tragic because we'd never figure out what it is about ultra processed foods that are driving the effects that you're so interested in. And with some other pushback from some outside organizations, we were able to prevent the closure. But they actually still took 30% of the beds from our unit, and that slowed our studies to a crawl. So there's been this kind of stigma against nutrition research, against these highly controlled metabolic studies that's been in existence for years. And so
You must have been ecstatic hearing that Secretary Kennedy was coming in excited about nutrition.
Well, I mean, it went even before that, right? I mean, to be fair, it was a bipartisan thing, right? Mm-hmm. So Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders were just as vocal about, diet-related chronic disease and ultra-processed foods and better understanding, these conditions that are now costing Americans so much suffering and so much economically as well. Not to mention, Medicare spending and Medicaid. And so there really was this movement of folks on both sides of the aisle. And even when Kennedy was running as an independent, the MAHA movement was really getting started, and you couldn't tell the difference between what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was saying about food and Bernie Sanders was saying about food. And the role of the food industry in marketing and creating these foods and pushing them. And so I was thinking, yeah, this might be, not only could we prevent further closure of our research, but we have to start really thinking about, no matter what happens in this election, how are we going to actually expand our research? How are we going to actually provide scientists outside the NIH with the kind of facilities that would allow us to supercharge this kinds of research, so that we could, instead of having a hypothesis and then 3 years later being able to answer it, how could we do that in months? And it really came down to this issue of, well, we just don't have the capacity to comfortably house and feed people and measure what they're eating and control their food environment. And by food environment, in our case, it's very artificial. We could do other things like have a little marketplace where we manipulate the prices of foods. We could have a restaurant where we change the menu labels, as well as the lots of behavioral science aspects, as well as just really the basic metabolic effects of these foods. So we put together a proposal that no matter who was going to be in office, we were going to start to try to pitch. And I worked on this with the director of the Office of Nutrition Research at the NIH, my colleagues at the Diabetes Endocrinology and Obesity branch in the Diabetes Institute, got input from several other people. And we were kind of putting together, like, what would we need to do to really supersize this? And as well as kind of demonstrate that if we could understand these things better, then we could actually make real changes. Like I said, we had that interim analysis in November where we suggested if we understood the mechanisms, we could create a diet that was still high in ultra-processed foods that doesn't cause overeating. And that could give policymakers, as well as manufacturers and regulators, the kind of information, as well as consumers, to make changes, practical changes in their diet. So I was super excited. And then the election turned out this way, and it was clear that by that point, the Republicans and RFK Jr. were talking more about this than Kamala Harris was talking about it. So I was like, okay, well, let's try to engage the folks who are leaders in the MAHA movement at the political level. I know there's a grassroots level, which is not necessarily thrilled with many of the things that are going on now. But at the political level, we can hopefully get some space to have some conversations about it. So I reached out to some folks multiple times. I got a couple like DMs back saying, oh yeah, let's send me an email, and sent them an email. It's like, okay, I know you're really busy, no response. A few weeks later, send another email. It's like, yeah, I'd really still love to talk, no response. Gee, this is weird. And then you see that they're engaging all the time with these social media influencers, right? Of like, who talk a lot about things which, I didn't see as being at the top of the list of problems that we should be focusing on, like food dyes, changing the color of Fruit Loops is not going to make Fruit Loops a health food, right? Changing from high fructose corn syrup to cane sugar in Coca-Cola is not going to make me want to promote Coca-Cola products as healthy products. So, maybe that's just the window dressing, the low-hanging fruit. I would hope so, but I didn't see a lot of engagement. They certainly were ignoring me, right? And then it was the transition period. At first, it was like, okay, no, you can't talk to outside people. You're not allowed to give talks at conferences. This was across the board for a period of time. When that was starting to, and to be fair, that happened in the Obama transition. I think it lasted for a few days as the new administration came in.
Within reason, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, they just kind of wanted to vet what was coming down the pike and whatnot. I don't know what the real reasons for these things are. But this lasted a little bit longer. And then eventually it was that some areas of research you could start. Maybe you couldn't practically travel, but you could at least give a talk virtually at a conference. Mm-hmm. And I had an invitation from the Bloomberg Philanthropies group in their either yearly summit on health and food. And they'd invited me to talk about ultra-processed food. And I said, well, I have to put it through the normal process. I'd be delighted to do this, but it has to pass through the NIH. What I learned was that there are certain topics that were deemed politically of interest. A bunch on diversity and health equity, nutrition and ultra-processed food was on the list.
Meaning like censorship, you're not allowed to talk about those
No,
things?
meaning that at that point it was like anything that was flagged internally at the NIH that was on these topics had to be approved by a political appointee. And so my request went up the chain and it was denied. I wasn't allowed to give this talk. And I'm like, okay, was it just the travel thing? Because we had to worry about travel stuff separately than these other things. And I went back to the Bloomberg folks and they, we would be delighted for you to do it virtually. Same response. And this is, meanwhile, now some of my colleagues are able to give talks on other topics, but not on ultra processed foods. So that was, and this is now, many, many weeks into this new administration. I wasn't allowed to give a talk about our research, which I never had that in my entire history of 21 years at the NIH. I've always been allowed to talk about our research at conferences and meetings like this. So, and then I'd been working on a paper with a bunch of researchers. I don't know if it's out yet. It was with the American Heart Association, working on a consensus statement on ultra-processed foods. It had lots of different pieces to it. There was one that a colleague of mine, one piece written by a colleague of mine who wrote about health equity aspects and how these foods are sometimes targeted to communities that are, have
low socioeconomic
exactly.
status, yeah.
And then I wrote some of the section on proposed mechanisms by which ultra-processed foods work. And again, the normal process is you submit your manuscript, it gets cleared, and it goes off and gets published. And in this case, it actually cleared, and then it was uncleared.
Okay.
I'm like,
how do they notify you that it's cleared and then uncleared?
So,
like they send you an email saying you're good?
Yeah. So I got an email saying, yep, we're good to go. Just submit the paper. And I wrote to my colleagues. I'm like, yep, we're good. Go ahead and submit. And then I got the unclear. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. I'm not sure what's happening. And I was told, and this is the level of the NIH, was that there was an executive order about health equity and certain language around health equity that's prohibited. And so if you want to remain an author on this paper, you've got to address the section of the paper on health equity.
Address it, like remove it?
That could have been an option. That probably would have satisfied their concerns. I didn't want to press it because I'm not willing
That's
to.
That's not your part
either.
either.
Not my part. I'm not willing to censor my colleague, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is complete and total nonsense.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, fine, I'm off. I'm off as an author. And of course, everyone was like, oh, well, maybe we could, try this. I'm like, no, we should not change the wording to satisfy this kind of level of censorship of what's a legitimate scientific question about how different groups in this country who have health disparities are being differentially targeted by marketing schemes and whatnot. It's a perfectly legitimate thing. It's not my area, but it should not be edited.
Right.
So that was the second piece. And then we had I was really excited about this piece of research conducted by a superstar postdoc in my lab who actually now has a tenure track position at NIH, where we were addressing the question about whether or not ultra-processed foods high in fat and sugar can cause the same kind of changes in the brain's dopamine response as highly addictive drugs. Because there's all this rhetoric about, sugars as addictive as cocaine. Right. And from our colleagues in the Addiction Institute, there's been a really interesting progress in understanding the biochemical mechanisms, or at least correlates of addiction. And one of them is that drugs that are highly addictive, many of them give rise to this, supersized dopamine response in brain reward regions, which hijack them. And over time, you build up a tolerance and changes in the receptor numbers in the brain. But initially in the early phases, you should be able to detect a big change in dopamine. And then people who become addicted or develop tolerance, you'll be able to see it gets downregulated, the receptors and even the response. So we designed this big study looking at 50 people with a very wide range of BMI, wide range of, if the idea was, if people with obesity are addicted to ultra-processed foods high in fat and sugar in the same way that people that are addicted to cocaine, then the more fat you have on your body, the lower your dopamine response should be to eating the ultra processed food, in the same way that the addicted person taking the cocaine is going to have a lower response than a person who's not addicted. And so we designed a study to test that effect. And it was a large study because we're now looking at for a correlation between body fat and the dopamine release. And we presumed we were going to see a dopamine release when we gave these kinds of foods, because really small studies in the past had shown it, and we were taken in by the rhetoric that we're going to see we're going to see the dopamine. We kind of presumed we would see it. And when we looked at the data, we didn't see, on average, any dopamine response that was measurable using the same techniques that our colleagues in the addiction.
So it's not even that there wasn't a change; there was no response.
Well, the methods that are being used have relatively low sensitivity, so you have to see a really big response in order to measure it reliably. And yeah, when you give cocaine, methamphetamine, even nicotine in many studies, you can see this response. And we presumed you'd see it with food. And in fact, other people had shown it with food. But then when we look back at those other studies, they were so tiny and it was driven by only a couple of outliers. And the studies weren't really designed to test this idea. And so we kind of think that maybe they were underpowered and it was like a false positive. Because when we did it in a much, much larger group of subjects, there's a lot of variability. So some people respond, some people don't respond. But on average, there was no mean change in dopamine in the reward regions of their brain. And there was no relationship even with that variability with adiposity or BMI.
Interesting.
So it was interesting. Our conclusion was not that there's no dopamine response. It's just lower than these
sensitivity,
drugs, right? That
possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's an opioid response. Maybe it's something else. Maybe there really are people who are addicted to food in similar ways, but we didn't.
The pathway is not unknown yet.
The pathway is unknown, or maybe we recruited the wrong folks in this particular study. It was had all that nuance associated with it. And this was a study that ran over COVID. Like, it was a huge amount of work to do this. And so we put together, we'd had a press release already, and this was now the transition period. The paper was already accepted. It was coming out in the next several weeks. And we were saying, yeah, no press release. This was now, again, at the level above NIH, because all ultra-processed food stuff was being evaluated by a political appointee. And we were, okay, maybe we can put together not a press release, which had quotes from us, and maybe we'll just put what they called a media advisory, which is like just a very short paragraph saying this paper's coming out, no quotes, denied, none of that. So we're like, okay, this is really weird. And so, but the journal puts out, it was part of their special issue on obesity. They put out their notification to journalists.
Right.
One of them from the New York Times says that they're really interested in interviewing me about the paper. And so we do the usual thing. I put it to our media office to get approval. And then I hear, yeah, HHS isn't approving this interview. And this reporter had interviewed me many times in the past. And she's like, what's going on? This is really weird. Like, is there a reason I'm not giving the chance to interview? I've done this many times before. Were you not happy about like the way the articles turned out? Sure. Did I do a hack job of the study? Like, what's going on? And it turned out then she told me she got a call from the Health and Human Services communications director, who asked if this was really an article about RFK Jr. because the results of the study don't support his views on ultra-processed food. And that was my reaction. I'm like, wait a second. So the concern is that this isn't really about the science. That this interview is about somehow saying that the science doesn't agree with. First of all, I don't know that it disagrees. I don't know what RFK Jr.'s views are on ultra-processed foods. And certainly I didn't think that my study had anything to say about that these foods might be addictive in many people, be harmful.
You were looking at a mechanism.
Exactly. I'm like, what's going on? And then so I'm like, okay, this is really weird. And apparently in that discussion, she convinced him this isn't, she was going to talk about how she wasn't going to be able to interview me. That was the only thing that would be weird about the piece that she was writing. But it really was about, are ultra-processed foods addictive, and what does this new study say, and how does it relate to what other folks are saying? And so I guess she got permission to give written questions. So we got her written questions, and me and my co-author, we wrote our responses, and we got some input from the Addiction Institute because it was obviously related to addiction, and we worked those responses together. And I said, okay, well, here are our responses, and submitted them to our press office. And then the next day, I got CC'd on the email back to the reporter from the press office, and the responses had been edited, and they were downplaying our study. They were saying, in response to, I think the question was, what's the most important takeaway from the study? This is clearly not something I would have written. This was a very small study in a limited number of ultra-processed. It's like, I'm fully aware of all the limitations.
Yeah.
We have another paragraph about that lower down. But that's not the most important takeaway, that this was a small study. In fact, this is the largest study of its kind that had ever been done. And there were other edits throughout this to really try to downplay, whether or not these results have anything to say about ultra-processed foods. And
I mean, that's unprecedented.
yeah, I couldn't believe it. And, I think it was characterized as censorship, but when I talked to folks afterwards, but it's worse
More
than
than that.
censorship, right? I mean, they're literally,
Manipulation of
they signed my name to something. And it was funny because Alice, the journalist, then wrote back and said, oh, who do we attribute these responses to? And the media folks called me like frantically, like, okay, what am I supposed to say? I'm like, my advice to you, because these were edited, is you don't respond to this email, because clearly either you're going to lie to them and say that whoever edited them, I have no idea who edited them. It's I'm guessing it's probably the HHS communications director, or at his direction they were edited, because he was the one who expressed concerns about the piece, and said that they didn't agree with RFK Jr.'s views on ultra-processed foods, which was news to me. Or you're going to have to say who edited them. And I don't envy you in either situation. So I suggest you just don't respond to the query. And of course, I made sure that the reporter
knew that
what our original answers were. And when she quoted from them, she only quoted from the parts that we had answered, not the edited version. But yeah, this was so concerning to me now, because not only were we not able to give talks, not only were we not able to publish our papers in the normal way, but now they're manipulating the way that we communicate our results to the public. And I was really concerned that, well, what about...
And not for any good reason. They're not saying, oh, this is complex science speak, we're trying to translate. They're literally changing how data should be interpreted based on the fact that it disagrees with someone's opinion.
Right. And, I would have even been open to a discussion about it, right?
Right.
I mean, call me and tell me why you don't like our responses.
Right.
And I can argue about it. And yeah, I can still tell you you're full of shit, but at least engage me in this exercise. Right. That did not happen. I've had no direct communications with the folks at HHS ever. And so yeah, it was just like crazy. And so what I'm worried about at this point is that, okay, if they didn't like the reporting of the study results, I've got this other study, like I said, that's just, we're going to wrap up very, very soon. What if this case, the paper was accepted already, right? What's it going to be like when I now submit? I've already got the precedent of it not being released to be submitted for peer review, right? I had to remove myself as an author from that other paper. What about now my main paper? If they don't like the messaging around the results, are they going to try to manipulate the way the paper is written? That's unacceptable to me. And what about a new study I want to design? Are they going to manipulate the way that the study is designed in a way that's going to potentially give rise to the result that they want? And more concerningly, it suggested to me that they're not interested in what the science has to say. If it complicates their narrative that ultra-processed foods are as addictive as cocaine and work by the same mechanism, who the hell cares about that? From a practical standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, it's important. Then that's a huge problem. If the premier biomedical research organization in the world is no longer interested in communicating science, that's the genuine fear, because it might interfere with a preconceived narrative.
Which is the exact opposite of what research is. Research, like you were saying at the beginning of our conversation, you would be excited to learn something if it disagreed with your preconceived notions. They, on the other hand, don't want to hear disagreement. They want to hear confirmation only.
Right. And I can see how, I mean, science has a way of introducing complexity and nuance when it's done right in a way that complicates things. I get that. And if you want to move fast and break things and just kind of get something done, I can understand why it would be inconvenient to have that science. And if I thought that they were doing all the right things, maybe I could be more forgiving of, okay, well, yeah, let's suppress some of the inconvenient stuff for a while or downplay it, but we're not going to manipulate your studies. If they come back and say, okay, look, just, maybe
this one press release,
like,
because it wasn't done with us on board.
Yeah.
But you were being reasonable.
I was hoping to be reasonable. Yeah. And so I actually then wrote to RFK Jr., several of his deputies, because who knows who's reading these things, Jay Bhattacharya, Matt Memoli, and other folks at NIH, and just kind of said, look, and this is right around the time they're starting to, fire people. They set up all these programs to get people to leave voluntarily. And one of those programs was voluntary early retirement. And what they do is basically retirement from the federal government has one huge benefit, which is you get to keep your health insurance for your family. I'm Canadian originally. It would normally seem like a big benefit, but it's a huge benefit, right? Because health insurance is extraordinarily expensive.
Yeah.
And if you can get health insurance for life, that's a big benefit. And they made that available to people. They dropped the retirement age to 50, and I'm 54, and you had to have 20 years of service. I had 21 years of service. And I thought, look, I'm either going to hate my job every day if my worst fears turn out to be true, in which case I'm going to quit. I'm going to lose my health insurance, and it's going to be a huge problem. Or I can take early retirement and preserve my health insurance, or I can try to convince somebody to sit down and talk with me and tell me why I'm misled and misguided by this. And so I wrote this email to all these senior folks at HHS and NIH saying, look, here's what we're doing, some of the world's leading research on ultra-processed foods and trying to figure out why many of them are bad for us and what we can do about it. We're having a lot of success. We're conducting the premier research in the world. I kind of pointed out some of the interim results and how that might be effective for policy. I said how excited I am about the MAHA movement, right? This group of folks across the country, this grassroots initiative that has finally made diet-related chronic disease, put it on the map of what's a super important thing to solve. And the fact that we actually I submitted a proposal, and they've been working with folks at NIH about how to provide the kind of facilities for researchers around the country to conduct studies that are much better than the ones that I'm currently able to conduct and get answers much more quickly. But here's my concern. My concern is that I'm getting censored and that you're not interested in the science and manipulating the communications to the public. And I'd love to sit down and talk with you about this and why I just might have all this wrong. And I really hope I do have it all wrong. But otherwise, I don't see any way forward. And by the way, while all this is happening, we're having troubles buying food for our participants because of the stuff that they're doing with purchasing and purchasing agents getting fired. Right. We're having troubles buying supplies for our studies. We haven't been able to use CGMs for a long time because we haven't been able to purchase them. We had a period of time where these wonderful recent undergraduates who do the vast amount of the legwork and the study coordination and whatnot, we weren't able to replace them for a period of time. I think that's finally lifted, but it was bleak, super bleak. And the leadership of our institute and the intramural side of NIH told me, yeah, we don't see this getting any better, and it's only going to get worse when they start to try to consolidate institutes and change the organizational structure. Right. So I'm like, gosh, this is really horrible. I want to sit down and talk to some folks about this, and at least
find out the plan.
Found out the plan. What is the plan, and how can we actually do something good, at least in the midst of all this chaos and destruction?
What did you hear back?
I heard nothing. And I know that someone read my email because the Office of Nutrition Research Director said, "Hey, yeah, I saw your email." I'm like, I didn't send it to you. And she says, no. The NIH director's office sent it around to a bunch of people, just kind of as an FYI. I'm like, oh, well, someone read it and bothered to send it around to a bunch of people in NIH, but they didn't bother to respond to me. So I basically started the process, a weeks-long process of having my staff reassigned, assigning my protocols to other people, closing down a lab that I'd had for 21 years at the NIH. And yeah, it kind of ended one day in April, and I had instructions of where to put my badge and my parking pass and my office key, and had cleaned out all of my desk. And yeah, it was a very, very sad day. I mean, I loved my job. I mean, this was a place I'd spent 21 years at. I mean, I took a pay cut to go there. I came from that biotech company. We had lots of freedom. I told you about the kind of support that I had in our institute, despite, some struggles along the way. This was, my dream job. And I thought we were starting to make a difference. I thought we had all this amazing opportunity to really expand on it and give folks around the country the kinds of facilities that we had access to only on a greater scale to really improve nutrition science, which has been chronically underfunded, like I said. Yeah. So it was a very sad day, and I posted on social media, and it got a little bit of press attention.
Understatement.
And then the next day I got a DM from Jay Bhattacharya, the NIH director, on X, saying, "Oh, I heard about your retirement."
Oh, now you've
heard about it. And I sort of
well, it's a very media focused administration.
Yeah, right. That's probably true. If you're on the news and I was in the news, then you might get some attention. And so I said, I'm delighted to hear from you. I'd love to talk. And he invited me back to the NIH campus the next day. And yeah, it was really interesting. First time as a visitor at the NIH since I interviewed 22 years prior or so. And
you thought you might be able to go back?
Well, I didn't know. I had no idea at that point, right? I mean, I left. I didn't have a lab, so there was nothing to go back to. My staff had all been reassigned. My protocols had been reassigned, and basically closed. I've been able to
What were your colleagues saying?
So it was interesting. I mean, some of them were, especially after the media attention, they were actually really heartened by the fact that there was such an outpouring of support, because up until that point, it'd just been bleak, and seeing colleagues fired. And by the way, all the press office folks that dealt with all this stuff, they'd all been fired. And so, several of them were just very supportive, and they were delighted that it was getting some attention in the public, that basically there was kind of destruction of the biomedical research enterprise going on. And even something as high profile as ultra processed foods that were obviously the huge MAHA movement was based around, much of that was part of the momentum and much discussion about it, that even in that kind of space where everyone would have expected there to be all this support, we weren't getting it. And so anyway, I got the chance to meet with Jay Bhattacharya and the deputy director for intramural research at the NIH, who was like the top of the food chain of the intramural side, which was where I was at the NIH the next day. And it was clear that Jay Bhattacharya wanted to talk about the censorship thing most of the time, and because he feels like he was censored during COVID, and he has a deep personal sort of experience about that. And he was also kind of shocked about the usual process that we've had for decades and decades of having to have manuscripts cleared before. But I was like, yeah, that's never been a problem before. And I can even understand maybe why there's a hiccup with that. But what about this editing of the responses. And he kind of didn't believe me at first. I kind of showed him some signal screenshots of here's what happened. And he was like, he kind of didn't really, and he was like, oh, well, maybe this was all just sort of, you know, a miscommunication or something. I'm like, that'd be great if it was, but then why didn't anyone respond when I tried to reach out, even before the election, right? I mean, you know, why is no one engaging in this? And he said, you know, well, he's not sure, and he thinks that there's things that he wants to do at NIH to improve the ability for people to have opposing viewpoints. And he said all the right things, and I kind of shifted to the question of, well, look, there's all this destruction going on. One of the things that I proposed in that email that is about how to improve, like how can you build something, how to improve nutrition science. And it was clear that he'd read the document, and he'd even read the transition plan, because he said, oh yeah, I saw that the clinical center has a really low census right now. Maybe we could expand beds for your facility while we built something else. And I said, yeah, that would be amazing. He said, well, yeah, I'd like to work on this with you. And he shook my hand and he said, welcome back. I said, well, I'm not back yet. I don't have anything to come back to, but I'd be delighted to work on this new initiative. And he said, okay, well, talk to the deputy director here, and we'll figure out a way for whether we can do this. And so for the next weeks, you know, I worked with the Office of Nutrition Research Director and the Deputy Director for Intramural Research and other folks. And it was presented in a couple of other meetings, not that I wasn't a part of. And I got, you know, feedback that was pretty glowing, and everyone was really on board and excited about this possibility. So I thought I was going to go back, and I made it very clear, like, I would love to come back. You know, before I retired, I checked with, you know, human resources, can I come back and work full time? And like I triple checked, and I was like, yeah, you can do that. It's not a problem. And so I was getting very excited that we would finally be able to kind of achieve something and be able to get rapid answers to the kinds of questions that many of the folks in the MAHA movement have been begging for answers to for quite some time, and at least improve the quality of the evidence on these things. And then a couple weeks into this, many back and forths, we were talking to the Foundation for NIH about raising money for this, all sorts of stuff. I get this call out of the blue from the Office of Nutrition Research Director, and he said, yeah, I don't know what happened, but I was just told it's not going to happen. It's dead. And I was like, what? What's the reason? He said, I couldn't get a reason. I don't know. And I knew that the Deputy Director for Intramural Research was supposed to meet with Jay Bhattacharya the next day. I didn't tell her that I got this phone call. I wanted to see how that meeting went. That was a Friday. I emailed her on Monday and said, hey, so how did it go? And this person who'd been very optimistic in the past basically wrote to me and said, yeah, Jay wasn't there. I talked with Matt Memely, who is the kind of political interim appointee deputy director. And yeah, she said, it's not going to happen. And I don't see a path forward. And I wish I could. I'm usually an optimistic person, but that's how I see it. I was just like,
yeah, terrible.
Okay, I guess it's not going to happen. And that's where it left. And so, yeah, so I'm not going back to NIH anytime soon.
I mean, I think that symbolizes where the administration currently falls, of making a lot of promises, and then when there's an opportunity to do the thing, it's not done. And the things that they are doing are perhaps minutia related or not beneficial at all, or not borne about by evidence. So that's obviously very concerning to me. For individuals that want to support you, you know, I just had Dr. Jen Gunter on, and she said she gave a speech somewhere in Australia. There was a billionaire in the audience who ended up funding an endometriosis research institute for $50 million or something. So maybe we have a billionaire listening. If people want to reach out to support you, where can they reach you? Well,
yeah, they can reach me on my website, kevinhallphd.com. I didn't have one before. I'd have one now. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the question is, can we, if the NIH isn't going to do this, is there another path forward? Can we actually provide the nutrition science and metabolism community with the kind of support that they need to actually come up with answers to these questions in a rapid way. Can we actually, we're not talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about, tens of millions of dollars. If you're building it from scratch, if you're renovating, it's, much less than that. And there's stages that we could kind of get to. I think that this kind of research is super important. I think it's been lacking for a long period of time. And I think that, I've been talking with some folks about how could we best do this? How could we best put together the kind of institute that would allow for even industry to have that kind of Chinese wall of sponsorship where they have absolutely no say in the research that gets conducted and the ability to manipulate or influence the research, but they experience in a way that is non-competitive the insights, right? I mean, and how will that inform our policymakers? What's the right science that needs to get done in order to make a difference? Because, I fear that, and I hope I'm wrong, that addressing food dyes and discussing ultra-processed foods in the way that they're being discussed actually does move the needle on public health. My fear is they're not targeting the right things and that they're expending this enormous political capital that the MAHA movement has really earned, right? I mean, never before in kind of the history of the U.S. since maybe the dawn of the 20th century when the FDA was created, did we have this popular movement of people that were concerned about the food in the American food system. Yeah. And I don't want that squandered. I want that used to kind of advance the science and really give people the answers that they deserve, not just the ones that are easy to do or might sound good.
I'm not optimistic about our current administration, but I am optimistic for you to get the Dream Lab. I'm going to work on my part to try and do whatever we can to help amplify your message. Obviously, I want to thank you for your work that you've done historically and continue to do in fighting for this, because I think it's leaders like yourself that ultimately will get us the answers that I need as a primary care physician to help my patients, that my loved ones need in order to help guide their health decisions. So I thank you for that. I think the audience really thanks you for that. Definitely going to be linking your website in the description of this conversation. I definitely learned a lot, so I most definitely want to thank you for all of it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was a conversation with someone who understands the weaknesses and strengths of different research. I want you to watch a different conversation to see how perhaps someone else might handle it. Click here to see my interview with Dr. Jason Fung, where he believes that calories in and calories out isn't exactly all that. As always, stay happy and healthy.